All right. Okay. So, couple things. One, we have the exam. You just hand me your exam, so that's good. There will be a third exam that I will. I haven't posted potential questions yet, but it won't be very long. There just isn't as much for this third section, so there'll be some, but not too much. Shouldn't take too long. Make sure you turn in your paper by the end of May, if possible. If you haven't turned in your rough draft and you still want to submit a rough draft, have me look at it. I can certainly do that, and then get it back to you. I really only say the end of May because I think you're all planning on taking Hebrew. Are you taking Hebrew? Okay, then you can turn your paper in whenever. But once the summer gets going and you're taking Hebrew, you're gonna want to focus on Hebrew. So you don't really want a paper hanging over you. So and you'll enjoy your summer much more if you just turn your paper in and get it over with.
Yes. Yeah. 2 weeks.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't. I'm not a huge stickler for when it has to be in. It's just more for your sake of you just don't want it hanging over you. That's kind of a pain. So.
Did you? There was never a response article or anything?
There was not. I could not find the article that I wanted. And I had a specific one in mind, and I searched, and I couldn't really find it. And by the time I found one that would have worked, it was like, you know what, I'm just going to skip it. So I never got around to it. Yeah. Thought about it. No, you do. Yeah.
Search exam, can I do that as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. I will get that to you. Yep. And I'll get you a little study guide for that one as well.
Thanks. And is that one due then?
That's kind of whenever. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. There's, I think, 25 or 30 questions on it, and yeah. But I'll give you the study guide for that one. It's not too bad. It's more outlines and. I don't think there's any essay. Yeah, I think the whole thing I think is like 150 questions, and they're all short answer of, just almost reads kind of like a Bible trivia question or test, but a little more advanced than that, but there's no real essay. It's all, short answer. There's nothing terribly deep and theological. That comes under the theology exam. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things I want to do this morning, just to be crazy, is do a pop quiz.
Hey.
So we'll take this together, but let me find what I'm looking for here. Well, is this it? No. I think. Did I accidentally delete it? I don't think I accidentally deleted it, but I might have. Found it. That was weird. Okay, here we go. Nope. Hold that thought. Yeah, I think I may have deleted it. I don't know why I would do that. Look, okay. Which prophet was concerned when God was apparently planning on using the wicked Babylonians to punish the wickedness of Israel? Yep. Everybody on that one? Okay. Which prophet foretold the downfall of the Edomites? Yeah. Yep. Which prophet gave specific dates for each of his sermons, such as the 17th day of the 7th month, almost directly related to the delay, excuse me. Read that again. Which prophet gave specific dates for each of his sermons, such as the 17th day of the 7th month, almost all directly related to the delay in rebuilding the temple? Good. Which prophet focused his prophecies as answers to a series of questions from Israel, such as whether it was worth it to serve God? Everybody got that one? Good. Which prophet served in northern Israel and famously foretold that Israel would return from Assyria in the same way that Israel had been called out of Egypt? Which prophet used the famous phrase, "For these three things and for four," and claimed he was not born a prophet? This prophet is famous for his lawsuit format against Israel. He quotes several times from Isaiah, his contemporary, and refers to Israel as a cauldron with its leaders as the meat, ripe to be eaten by the Babylonians. Is that what you're going to say?
I was gonna hazard a guess.
Were you going to guess Micah?
Yeah.
Yes, Micah. Yep. Much debate has raged over the identity of this book's author. Some divide the book into two sections, with the section called Deutero whatever. Others suggest even a third author who has far more hope than the other two and is sometimes referred to as Trido. The Song of the Vineyard or the story of Assyria as an axe are both from this prophet. Who is the first person to be called a prophet in the Old Testament? Abraham. Yes, Abraham. Name several prophets that did not write books. Who are some famous false prophets? Harder.
Yeah, that is harder. Trying to think of that guy's name who was in.
Zechariah is the son of Edo.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
That name was in my head there.
I say the prophets of Baal. That doesn't.
Sure, why not? Yeah.
Is Micaiah one?
Everyone in Ahab's court but Micaiah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes, he was the good one.
Right.
Yep.
That's tough. What's the one in? Is it Amos? And there's a.
Yeah, he's actually a priest.
Okay, but he's like go prophesy back in the south.
Yep.
There's the false prophet.
Pelatiah is the one in Ezekiel that drops dead.
Okay.
And then there's one in Jeremiah who had, I want to call him Hanani, but I don't think that's his name. It is Hananiah. Sorry. Hananiah is the one who grabs the yoke off of Jeremiah's shoulders. Who's
that prophet who gets the other one killed when he tells him to go in and eat?
Yes.
I can't remember the name, but it's during the time of Jeroboam.
Is he unnamed?
Yeah, he's just called the Old Prophet.
Okay, there we go.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other named by name. I don't think so. That might be about it. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are the primary ones who have false prophets. And then it's either Amaziah or Azariah or Ahaziah, something Hananiah. Let's see here. Amaziah, who I believe was a priest, but the one in Kings is just referred to as the false prophet from Bethel, and the other one is called the man of God. What prophet foretold the downfall of Nineveh? Not Jonah. That'd be too easy.
That was
Nahum. Yep. That one's easy to remember because they both start with N.
Yeah.
Nahum, Nineveh. Which prophet told of the nations being judged in the valley on the day of the Lord, signs in the heavens and an outpouring of God's Spirit? Mm-hmm. What are some other names for prophets?
Seers,
Mm-hmm.
man of God,
Uh-huh.
covenant lawyers, maybe? Or
Yeah, we sometimes use that term. Yeah. They're not always called that in scripture, but we sometimes use, the divine prosecutor as the name. I think at least once. I don't know if it's necessarily a term that's used of good prophets, but sometimes oracle is a term that's used. Although sometimes that ends up being more of a reference to the speech rather than the name for seer. It's literally the seer, SEE-ER.
Yeah.
And it comes from the Hebrew word to see, ra. And so this is the roeh. It's the person who sees.
Yeah.
There's also chazeh, which is having a vision. And so that also has the idea of seeing. I almost think of that one of the word looks like hazy. And so things are a little hazy, but he's looking ahead. That's how I remember that one. And then Navi is the typical word for prophet. But then the actual, what it is that he's having is sometimes called the hazeh, the hazeh, the vision. But sometimes it comes from that first word to see, ra'eh, but it'll have a mem on the front of it, the letter M, which signifies kind of a noun. If you put an M or a T on the front, sometimes you can take a verb and make it a noun. So that's the word for vision. Those two words get used sometimes. Sometimes it's a prophecy. So the prophet is having, the word to nava is to prophesy. So he's having a prophecy. But sometimes the word oracle is used, or burden, which is almost like a load, a masa. It's that's what Malachi uses of this burden. That almost seems to become more common as you move on. It's tough with some of these of sometimes the word is actually used earlier, but it just becomes more obvious because of where they use it later on. And it's sometimes hard to know because we only have one Hebrew book. So we're comparing everything to the same book. It's a big book, but it's only one. So it becomes hard when we make assumptions about what words mean, because we don't always know the nuance because we don't have anything to compare it to. So was it a burden in the sense that, oh, I'm just so burdened with this? Or was it just a technical term that, it's the thing that's lifted up. So is it possible that it's just they took up their vision? They took up their message. So it's hard to know how we would nuance that of, are they annoyed that it's a burden, or is it just a burden? And sometimes some of those little nuances are difficult to figure out, but you'll find commentators that assume they know. So almost a word of caution there of okay, yeah, it's the technical term, and it does mean burden. It is the thing that is lifted, but as to whether or not that's a positive or negative term, sometimes it's hard to know. But that becomes a common term, especially by the end, by Malachi. He's talking about his burden. So, yeah.
Is a dark saying one that's ever used?
Dark saying.
So, in Proverbs 1:6, it says that the wise man will understand a dark saying. And I was just wondering if that is ever used of something in Proverbs.
That is a good question.
In my mind, I'm like Proverbs and dark saying.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I would say no, but let me double check that before I say no. Let's see. Sometimes the word for a dark saying can also be a riddle.
That's what ESV has. Understand the proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles.
Yeah, that's Ezekiel 17:2. Son of man, put forth a riddle, looks like this is King James, so they don't consistently translate it. And speak a parable unto the house of Israel. So that's the word is hidah, which comes from hud, to put forth.
The one I'm looking for is the one before that, the one that's translated enigma or saying. It's melitza.
Ah, yes.
Melitza. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Melitza is usually when I see lutz, which is the root, I think of mocking. I think one of the problems with Hebrew is that all these words have like 67 different whatever. So scorner, to scorn, to mock, to deride, to mock, to interpret. So you're like, huh, that's odd. That one shows up in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 6 is the only other place it shows up. It only shows up twice in the Old Testament. Shall not these take up a parable against him and a taunting proverb against him, and say, woe to him that increases that which is not his? Yeah, so there they translate it as a taunting proverb in Habakkuk 2:6, and it almost seems to be almost somewhat negative. Yeah. Even then, let's see, a mashal is typically a proverb, but it shows up in Ezekiel, put forth a riddle, speak a parable, a mashal, against Israel. Shows up again in Micah chapter 1. In that day, one shall take up a parable or a proverb against you and lament and say, we are utterly spoiled. So you don't always think of prophets as doing proverbs, but Isaiah 14:4, you shall take up this proverb, mashal, against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased, the golden city has ceased. So yeah, it's difficult because each of these has a well, it's funny that it says you shall understand, this is in Proverbs 1:6, you shall understand a proverb and the interpretation, but it probably would be better to translate it as a proverb and a mocking proverb. It's got the possessive on the end, melitza, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a possessive because the noun itself is feminine. So they seem to have translated the kametz hey at the end of melitza as a possessive mashal and its interpretation, but that's not required because the word is feminine, so it has that kametz hey at the end anyway. So Proverbs 1:6 would probably be, I wonder if the ESV does its interpretation. the interpretation. Yeah, the interpretation. New King James has a proverb and an enigma, which doesn't really fit either. Proverbs and parables in the NIV. To understand a proverb and a saying in the ESV. See, none of them have the, this is one of the things that I love about Hebrew, is that it just nuances words just a little bit. It's not just a saying, it's almost almost put it in the category of sarcasm, because it comes from that root lutz, to mock. So you would almost, so it's not just a straight up interpretation, it's a proverb and a mocking, it's a little, sarcasm is defined as irony with malice. And there's just a little bit of malice in a malitza of we're mocking you just a little bit, taunting you. So it's a
little bit of irony.
Yeah. So what especially as you look at the parallelism, the proverb and the malitza, the words of the wise and the riddle, the dark saying, the dark saying, and you got 4 words and they're in parallel. So the proverb, the words of the wise, the malitza, and the dark saying, there's some grayness to them. These are hidden things. These are almost biting things in some places. These are so they're riddles, but they could also be almost mocking limericks. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? It doesn't, because you're barren. Haha, sucks for you. The kind of the biting, that biting irony, although people have debated if Mary, Mary, quite contrary, if that was really written about Queen Mary, but some people have suggested that it was written to mock her for not having children. It's debated, but again, there's just a little bit of sarcasm, which is funny when you think about it. So you got these prophets, and we think of them as kind of "Thus saith the Lord," and yet there's also an element of which it's "Thus saith the Lord." It's almost you almost don't think of it in that category, but when you look at the vocabulary of what they use to describe their prophecies, riddles, mockings, tauntings of, they're going to mock you. You're an idiot. You think you're so wise, but so there is this, it's not just this is going to happen. And it's not even just judgment. I mean, it is, but the idea of mocking, which is kind of weird when you think about it. We've got the imagery a lot of going out and stomping on the the heads of the wicked and them being turned to ashes, and this whole horrific scenes, all their slain bodies in the book of Revelation. But there's also a sense in which the kingdom of light is going to mock the kingdom of darkness. The daughter of Zion mocks you. Where, O death, is your victory? There is this almost sense of gloating of, yes, on the one hand, we're humble because God redeemed us, but on the other hand, you've set yourself up against God. That was dumb.
Yeah.
So yes, we understand that, it's because of the Spirit.
It's like Psalm 2,
yeah.
the Lord's
Yes.
like the
Uh-huh.
kings. He sits in that and laughs.
Mm-hmm.
Derision.
Yeah. So it is a side of God and a side of prophecy we don't often think about. That, we can't say I'm better than you, but at the same time, I think there's a sense of there's a sense of sorrow, I think, as we consider the fate of the wicked, but yet there's also a mocking of Pharaoh, and there's a mocking of the king of Tyre, and there's a mocking of you think you're so wise. So, on the one hand, it's humbling, there, but for the grace of God, go I. But on the other hand, there is this sense of which maybe a little bit of gloating is appropriate, especially as, there's a mocking of Satan and a mocking of death and a mocking of you thought you won. You didn't. So, I mean, yeah, there's a sense of humor in a way that is appropriate. We were singing, we sing the Psalms on Sunday night, and we were singing one the other day, and I think the last line of it is, and we will strike them in the head and strike them in the head. I always chuckle as I read it. It's just, but that's the Psalms of there is this element of joy at the destruction of the wicked, and yet it's kind of an impersonal joy, as it were, of the category of the wicked, because, I feel sorrow that these people are going to hell. And yet sometimes it's very personal joy of, we're mocking the forces of darkness. Jesus, as he's in Colossians, as he leading them through the city, leading them triumphantly behind him. Most scholars think that this is very similar to when the Romans would capture prisoners and they would lead them through the city of Rome naked, and that Paul is referencing this is what he's doing to the powers and principalities that have set themselves up against the kingdom of light, that he's defeated them, and he's leading them right through the city, whatever city it is, but he's leading them through the city, making fun of them, he's taunting them. And so there's this element of taunting that is fascinating, we don't think about. So thank you for bringing that up.
It feels like in the prophets too, God sometimes does that. Even he almost, I think he kind of mocks the righteous sometimes with the methods that he uses. Almost. The theme is kind of interesting. Well, I'm going to answer your prayer, but I'm not going to use you or your methods. I'm going to do it my way. And there's almost a sense of, yeah, I'm God. So okay.
Yeah, you almost feel sorry for poor Barak when Jael is the one who delivers Israel. But at the same time, you also feel sorry for Jael, that you're the humor. You're the humor in the story, that you just drove a tent peg through a guy's temple as a woman, and that all Israel is mocking Sisera, but the fact that you're a woman is part of what added to the humor. Sorry. But yeah, you're right. I'm going to use the means that I'm going to use to shame the wise. 1 Corinthians 1-4. Yeah.
Have any of you ever heard of Jamie Soule?
I don't think so.
He's a Canadian songwriter, Christian songwriter. He does all these kids albums, all kinds of Old Testament things. That's how I learned the names of all the patriarchs. So he's got all these songs, but one of them is Jael, and it's just, it's a song of Deborah, straight word for word from the ESV.
Wow.
And he's got like a bunch of kids singing it, and they're like, she crushed this rose. And it just sounds so cheerful and happy.
Yes. That's hilarious. That's funny.
I've seen a T-shirt that has a skull with a tent peg through it, and it says "biblical woman."
Yeah, I've seen the ones. It's Jesus clearing the temple, and it says, what would Jesus do?" Yeah, but kind of along the same lines. Yeah, I need to find that one for my girls. Yeah. Maybe I should give that all to the girls softball team. Give them. Oh, I'm sure. It'd be funny though. This prophet is most famous for his night visions and describing the future killing of the shepherd, the priest who is the branch, and the peaceful king to come. Yeah. Night visions.
Sorry, I totally did not hear you say that.
Zechariah, sorry.
Yes, Zechariah. Yes, we've talked about the king priest, especially in the historical books. I really that prophecy of the branch. That's one of my favorite. Doesn't get talked about a lot, but yeah, I like that one. Yeah. And then the peaceful king, Zechariah 9, he's not coming on a war horse, he's coming on a donkey, humble, bringing in peace. Which is interesting that Israel expected him to come on a war horse, even though Zechariah is pretty clear that he's not coming on a horse. This prophet is not a prophet, nor is he ever called a prophet. His book is famous for his visions concerning the intertestamental period and perhaps the last days. Mm-hmm. This prophet was told he could not mourn when his wife died. He was the watchman for Israel who saw the glory depart and return to the temple on a vehicle with wheels. Oddly, for a prophet, he was stricken for a time and could not speak until the day Jerusalem fell. This prophet was from a priestly family, may have died in Egypt during the exile. His scribe is perhaps as famous as he. He ministered for over 25 years during the reign of several different kings. Jerusalem fell during his ministry. How many minor prophets are there? Good. Why are they called minor? All the prophets in the Old Testament are said to be like whom? Yep. All the prophets in the New Testament are portrayed to be like whom? Could be Elijah.
Oh no, I'm struggling to think of an instance where they're.
Is this something that's ever explicitly said? Because John the Baptist.
I don't know. I don't remember.
Elijah. But then the
What other New Testament?
is it Agabus, the prophet that tells Paul not to go to Jerusalem?
Yeah.
He's like, tie me up with a belt, and that sounds a lot like Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
With some of his, look at my diorama, I'm going to smash it. Kind of that.
Yeah.
Prophecy.
I don't know. I don't know what I had in mind when I wrote that.
Good,
I would.
Good.
Maybe like Christ. I don't know. Whose test am I looking at here? I think this is Will's. He put Christ, and I gave him a 1, so that must have been what I was thinking. What is the sign of Jonah, and how does it point to salvation in Jesus Christ?
Just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so Christ will be in the belly of the earth. Yep.
So just a fun fact, one of the things that has bothered me over the years is that Jesus says, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. I have not attempted to go back and recreate the calendar of the Holy Week to show why it had to be Thursday rather than Friday. But in the back of my mind, I've always considered it at least a possibility and thought someday I need to go study this and see, is it possible that Thursday was the Sabbath and then so on and so forth.
Because it was the high Sabbath that week, wasn't it?
Well, that's the theory, that Friday was the high Sabbath, Saturday was the Sabbath, and then Sunday was the, whereas the traditional view is Friday was both the high Sabbath, or Saturday was the high Sabbath and the Sabbath. And so since John uses the term preparation day, the thought is, they're preparing for the high Sabbath. And it seems usually the vocabulary is used for the day before the actual Sabbath, not a high Sabbath, but same thing. But I came across an interesting paper, and I saved it somewhere, that he goes through both the Old Testament and the New Testament and shows how 3 days, 3 nights was basically a stock phrase, and shows that there are actually many instances where 3 days, 3 nights did not literally mean 3 days, 3 nights. That there, and I forget where the other one, there's another famous example where it's only 2 nights, but it's called 3 days, 3 nights, because that's just the stock phrase. And so as the Jews are hearing it, they're understanding 3 days and the nights that go in between. So when he says 3 days, he doesn't mean 7 days or 2 days. He means 3 days, but the 3 nights that goes with it is, in our minds, 3 days is 2 nights. You go on a vacation, you're going to get 3 day, 2 night, 3 day, 2 night vacation. That's our stock phrase. But for them, 3 days didn't go with 2 nights. 3 days goes with 3 nights. And so, which I looked into it during Easter. There were things that were floating around, and they came across that article.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I might have even gotten it off the Gospel Coalition. And but he did a good job of explaining how, no, it's just a stock phrase. And as Jesus is saying it, nobody is thinking, okay, so that's Thursday night, that's Friday night, it's just their way of thinking and their way of speaking. It's a stock phrase. I've heard a couple of atheists have been like, oh, see, that disproves it. And he explains, no, that's not true. I'll see if I can dig that up. And
Jerry Powell Sr. always said it was Wednesday.
That's another theory.
And that was why anytime anyone asks, why don't we get Good Friday off of school? So they just didn't down Friday.
That's funny. Yes.
The next question is, why don't we get Wednesday?
Right.
There you go. Yes.
They never had an answer for that.
Yeah. Let me see if I could just Google it real quick. I'm not going to be able to find it. Yeah, I'm not gonna go find it. I'll have to do some digging and see if I can come up with it. How could you tell a true prophet from a false prophet?
Their prophet came true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Also, if it was highly offensive.
Yes. If it was popular, probably not true. Probably not true. Yep, that's convenient. Yeah. What books are the former prophets?
Joshua Judges.
Mm-hmm.
Samuel Kings.
Yep. And then classical prophet. What's a classical prophet?
Words are written down.
Uh-huh. Yep. So we typically don't think of Elijah and Elisha as classical prophets because they weren't written. Although we have a lot of examples of prophets that did not write. It's somebody who wrote down the book. So this was not on the original quiz. We've kind of mentioned it in passing, so we'll see how well you're paying attention. But in terms of the minor prophets, chronologically, which one probably comes first? Yes.
I remember that because it starts with A.
Yes, that's right. Amos. Yep. Yeah. One of the things we're going to talk about today is the way the 12 hold together, and there's been a lot of debate over the years as to whether or not Amos or Hosea goes first, and I don't know. I think there is one version where Amos comes right after Hosea, but I don't think there are any versions where Amos is first. It's always Hosea.
Interesting.
Yeah. Which is fascinating.
I guess I like the idea of Amos first because he's kind of like, it kind of is the beginning of the end, like, you thought the day of the Lord was a good thing. Surprise, it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
It just gets more and more intense.
Isn't he like the first prophet to bring a pronouncement of judgment against both the northern and the southern kingdom?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the first Adam's works kind of put into favor as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he kind of ushers in this new era of prophecy. And there's, we've talked about a number of reasons why that seems to happen. Elijah and Elisha, they don't have a book called Elijah or Elisha, and yet all the prophecies are written down. So, in some ways, they are written down, just not in a separate, book that has their name on it, which is kind of interesting. So, I want to go back and revisit a topic that we talked about a little bit last night, and that is the relationship between wisdom literature and the prophets. It's interesting. I don't know why I didn't think of it last night, but that is a classic position of Gerhard von Rad.
Comes up a lot.
It does. Yeah, he's kind of from the same era as Barth. In some ways, he is a neo-Barthian, but he's also I wouldn't put him in the category of evangelical. He's not a full-blown modernist or liberal theologian either, but he's definitely in that trajectory. So I'm not sure I would say he was a Christian. Actually, ironically, taught at the University of Heidelberg. But I don't know that I would put him in I'd have a hard time saying he was a Christian.
A lot of people quote him now.
They do.
Did you see Melodium for your biblical theology paper?
Yeah.
About Genesis?
Yeah.
I saw his name all the time, and everything I was reading, it was always as the foil,
Yes.
He said this, but this
Yep.
was wrong.
Yeah.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
never saw anyone quoting him favorably.
We don't have a lot of Old Testament theology has kind of fallen out of vogue in some ways, which is unfortunate. It's been a while since somebody sat down and written a complete Old Testament theology the way that he did. We have a couple. Kaiser, I think, wrote one. Paul House is probably one of the last ones, or Merrill wrote Kingdom of Priests, which has some good parts in it.
I thought it was I didn't read the whole thing, but the parts I read were less helpful than I expected.
Uh-huh.
I was like,
He
isn't well organized, I didn't think.
No, I wrote a pretty scathing review of it for one of my classes. I was not impressed. And part of it is Old Testament theologies are hard to write, just in general, because there's not a theological center really to the Old Testament in the truest sense. Unless you talk to Johnny Gibson. Yes. And I forget what he said the center was.
Kind of more of a, I get, from what I was picking up, it was more of like a plot line instead of one idea.
Yeah.
He had one specific sentence that he said.
Yeah, he summarized it. God's kingdom through covenant was kind of.
Yeah. One of the things that gets really difficult is that a true center in terms of theology is that you can tie every book into it.
Right.
Whereas most of the centers that have been suggested for Old Testament theology, you can tie most of the books into it.
Right.
So, what do you do with Song of Solomon?
Yeah.
Wisdom literature has been the classic foil for a center. But basically, they're trying to go through the Old Testament and show how everything ties into this one theme. And there's so many themes, and so it becomes difficult in terms of you almost need a multi-volume set to go through and explain what Israel's theology was. It's just there's so much in the Old Testament.
I'd be curious what you think about this. This is one of my favorites. I mean, really favorite books for understanding the Old Testament. Is Stephen Dempster's Dominion and Dynasty. It's part of the new Studies in Biblical Theology series. It's not long, but it's just like punchy. He's looking at the Tanakh layout of the Bible or the Old Testament. But yeah, he attempts, and I think does a really good job of tying it all through. God's pretty much God's people in God's place.
Yep.
The thing that carries through.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, when I had to write a paper on early in my classwork of what is a potential center, and I just went with the confession: who is God, and what does God require of man? And they didn't really like it. Almost because people are like, well, if you just say God, that's too simple. But I mean, that is the point of the Old Testament. He's revealing himself to his people and telling them what he requires of them.
Yeah.
So, in terms of dominion and dynasty, I would say, yeah, absolutely. But I bet some scholars would come along and be like, it's too easy. Yeah. Covenant's the center. Well, yeah, but covenant doesn't show up in wisdom literature. Which again is one of the challenges, even when we talk about wisdom literature and the prophets, is what are the criteria that you use to connect different genres of the Old Testament? I read a paper last night. I just Googled Daniel as wisdom literature just to see what would pop up. And that's where it referenced Von Rad. And I was like, how did I not remember that? Because he's pretty famous for believing that wisdom literature came from the prophets. And you'll want to read a little bit of him if you write that paper on Daniel. But the one guy, he's like, well, it's not wisdom literature because the word wisdom doesn't show up in Daniel very often. And it's like, well, yeah, but it doesn't show up in Song of Solomon either. So like I get Ecclesiastes, he says, I'm looking for wisdom. Job, I think it's Job 28, has this great soliloquy on wisdom. It's like, okay, yes, Proverbs, Job, yeah, I get it. Song of Solomon? Yeah, it's about wisdom. I don't really know of many people who say that Song of Solomon is not wisdom literature. That's pretty often thrown into the wisdom literature category. Not by everybody, because the Jews just say you shouldn't read it. I think the rabbis, they gave an age like 50, you have to be 50 before you're allowed to read it or something. And yet they read it in the synagogue. So how they put those two together, I don't know. But what's the criteria that we're using to evaluate these different books? And it becomes very similar even to the center of Psalms is not often considered wisdom literature, and yet there are clear wisdom Psalms. I just lost the name of the term. A miktam sometimes is thrown out as a potential proverb or wisdom psalm, and there are psalms that I would definitely say fall into that wisdom literature category. But what's the criteria that you use? The gut feeling, or the use of the word. So he goes through and tries to explain how the prophets gave rise to wisdom literature. Almost, I think, I was just skimming it, but I think almost because all their prophecies didn't turn out the way they wanted to. And so then it's kind of this frustration of, okay, we go from wisdom literature to prophetic literature to apocalyptic to wisdom literature of, here's what's going to happen. Well, it didn't happen the way we wanted it to, so there must be something else going on in heaven to, we're so confused, we don't know what's going on, and so we have wisdom literature, which all assumes different time frames. You've got to assume, as Von Rad does, you've got to assume that certain parts of the Old Testament are earlier and different genres like wisdom literature are later in order to make it work. Whereas, if we're holding to a classic view of Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon and, it's Solomonic, even if you say Hezekiah, and that, as Hezekiah's men are collecting the Proverbs, that there's somebody who's writing or finding some of these writings of Solomon and pulling them together. Well, that's still, 600, 650 BC. And then we know some of the prophets don't rise up until later, and Daniel takes place, 200 years later. So, is it, can it be possible that a book that was written earlier is giving rise to a book that was, chronologically, they can only go one way. They can't go the opposite way. So some of his theories are hard to prove, but he does raise the question of, well, how would you know? How would we evaluate Daniel as wisdom literature? Which is one thing that we touch on in the wisdom literature class. And actually, when we go over it next spring, I'm going to have to touch on it more now that we've had this conversation, because it's not something that I've thought about of just, it's similar to the prophets of, the academic dean says, here, you're covering these books. Okay. But never really thinking about why. When we did the Pentateuch, I listed it as Genesis through Joshua. And almost the minute the syllabus went up, I get a call from Tim Decker. Von Rad is very big on not a Pentateuch, but a Hexateuch, that there's 6. And he's like, are you going with Von Rad on this? Like, no, Joshua is just such this kind of weird book. It doesn't really fit with the former prophets. It does because it's history, but it's really more the finish of the Exodus. Because when the Deuteronomy finishes, they're not in the promised land. That's been the whole point of the Pentateuch, is to get into the promised land, and they're not there.
Right.
So you got to have Joshua to finish the story, and yet Joshua is not part of the Pentateuch. So Joshua is just kind of, I want to say useless book. It's very useful. But in terms of where it goes, it's a bridge of how you get from here to here. Almost like, how do we get from the Gospels to the Pauline epistles? Acts.
Yeah.
We've got to explain how we got from here to here. And even as Acts finishes in Acts 28, Paul's still alive. And yet we know that Paul's dead. So, even as the time that people are probably reading the book of Acts, he could potentially already be dead. And Luke just kind of throws it out there of, oh yeah, he lived for 2 more years in Rome. Why just 2 years? Well, he died. Well, you didn't say that. Well, yeah, I didn't feel like it. So, he knows, and you get the impression as you finish Acts 28 that he knows that he's dead. He doesn't put it in there. So it's almost this bridge, which is why Acts 29 became a thing,
Right.
that, we're the next chapter. But really, it's a bridge between the Gospels and the rest of the epistles and the writings, and et cetera. Joshua kind of fits that same mold of how you get from Deuteronomy beyond. But as you, I'm trying to think where I was going with that. When you think about then the prophets, how do we get from this era to this era? And how do we determine which books fall in that? Because if you say Joshua should be studied in the Pentateuch class, then everybody thinks you're a liberal going with Von Rad. If you put it with the historical books, everybody's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's a historical book. But you're left with, well, is it? So is Exodus. That's historical. So is that a historical book? What do we do with it? And you have to create these criteria by which you determine what book goes where. So same with Daniel of, Daniel's apocalyptic. Okay, well, we have criteria for that based on Revelation. So we're going to use a New Testament category, which works to some degree, but you're going to use a New Testament category of what apocalyptic is, and intertestamental literature from outside the Bible for what apocalyptic is. But if you're going to make the argument that it's wisdom literature, how do we define that? Yeah. And that's one thing I'm not so sure that Von Rad does a great job of, but does a better job probably than most of explaining what he means by how wisdom literature and what it is came out of the prophetic, but without using this word wisdom. I mean, he makes the argument that it's still wisdom, even though there's no mention of wisdom. That Daniel is still looking for wisdom, even though he doesn't necessarily use that word.
Does it have to be one genre?
It doesn't. It could fit into several.
Because Daniel seems like at least 2 books. You know what I mean? So here's the first
Genre
part.
bending.
Yeah.
Wisdom in and of itself just looks like a theme throughout all the Old Testament that, like, if you really wanted to, you can say it's all wisdom because,
Mm-hmm.
That's the center of the Old
I mean, if the
Yeah.
people are condemned for a lack of wisdom constantly,
Yes.
wisdom most times is what God says,
Mm-hmm.
and they're constantly condemned for that. And it's kind of, well, it's not explicitly said. It's the kind of implicit command is be wise.
Yeah.
Follow the Lord. And so I wouldn't be shocked if it it arise out of that, because even especially with the prophets, they're giving the words of the Lord.
Yeah.
That true wisdom mediated to the people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. That it's not so much that wisdom literature is the foil of a center, but that wisdom is the center.
For like Hebrew life, almost, as far as those who follow Yahweh.
Yeah. Yeah, that's.
I was thinking about Proverbs 25, where it says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, the
Mhm.
glory of kings to seek it out. It seems like wisdom is almost a kingly task. So I'm wondering if you could say, you've got priestly portions of the Bible that say, here's how you live with God in your midst. Here's how you live with holy God. He's your God. The king is supposed to seek wisdom to apply the law to the people. And when the king isn't being wise, that's when you get prophets who have to come in. So I'm wondering, Von Rad is saying that wisdom literature is because of the failure of the prophecies. I wonder if it's actually the other way around. The prophets come in because of the failure of the kings to have wisdom.
Yeah.
So you've got, David and Solomon are writing Psalms, and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Psalms. So you got all these sort of books of wisdom. And then that could also tie into, Daniel is a ruler in Babylon. He's the chief of all the wise men in Babylon.
Yeah.
And so in his office, he has to act in a kingly way and seek wisdom.
Right.
Do.
Yeah.
So
Solomon's kind of like that archetype of the wise king.
And then you can tie that, Job seems like he's a king or a ruler of some sort.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly he owns all this land, all these flocks, and all this stuff. He seems like a ruler of people. So
Yeah.
I wonder if that's almost a way you could tie wisdom literature together, is with the ruler, the king is supposed to be the wise one. The king's not the wise one, or the priests aren't recognizing the holiness of God. That's when the prophets step in to call them back to faithfulness.
In a way, then that would almost make you think that the prophets almost fulfill a prophet, priest, king role, in a sense, because they're obviously being prophetic. They have to mediate wisdom, which is that kingdom role. They're also mediating between God and people, because the priestly mediators are utterly failing as well. It's kind of what Malachi feels like the rightful priest in his book, because the priests suck. So I don't know. And that interesting foreshadowing of Christ to come. Here's just a lot of prophet, priest, kings in a row right before Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, the terms for wisdom and understanding, they tend to show up in Hosea and Micah, and then they don't really show up much beyond that in the other prophets. So the word wise, let's see. Obadiah and Zechariah both make fun of wise people, but the word wisdom itself does not show up. Again, we've already made the argument from Proverbs chapter 1 that some of this language does continue. Yeah.
I wonder if some of them rose from the Psalms as well, because it feels like a very prophetic nature to a lot of what David writes, and I wouldn't be shocked if you could make a stronger case that maybe it didn't rise from prophetic literature post-exile or during the exile, but the Psalms, I don't know, of there's most of that we would see as prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
Christ.
Yeah.
And maybe they were going back to that instead of, and so it still is prophetic in a way, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, it's interesting. There's just so much to unpack there, but wisdom literature almost tends to ignore the covenant, which is one of the kind of the fascinating things about wisdom literature, and why the whole idea of covenant as the center is sometimes hard to prove. Job completely discounts the presence of a covenant, because the whole point is to explain why bad things happen to good people. If you had a covenant, which is really what the friends are trying to argue on the basis of, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. And that may be one of the reasons why Job is set outside of Israel, seems to almost be potentially even set in Edom, that there is no covenant, so you can't appeal to that as the explanation for why things happen. Because that would create some problems of, well, is God not keeping his covenant because Job's a good person? Proverbs has a little bit about covenant, but still it's not really this system of blessings and curses, because there's a lot of extra biblical wisdom that is pulled in by Solomon potentially from the Egyptians and other sources that he pulls it in. Song of Solomon is a marriage covenant, but there's no real mention of the covenant between God and Israel, although some people have tried to allegorize it or typologize it and make it about that. And Ecclesiastes certainly doesn't mention covenant. So it's almost that it's outside of covenant, and yet when you go back and look at the prophets and look at the Pentateuch, and there's almost a sense in which, because of the covenant and the line of blessings and curses, wisdom kind of went out the window, which is an interesting pattern, that the wisdom literature almost seems to be calling them back to a wisdom that has been lost. Like you've fallen into a formula of do this, good things happen, do this, bad things happen. But at the same time, also an element of, well, you're an idiot for not doing the good things so that the good things happen. So, there's kind of the both and. So that as you have Psalms and other books, proclaiming the wisdom of God, and it's almost as though they're trying to interact with the realities in Israel in terms of what Israel has become or how Israel works. There's a couple places where David, even in the Psalms, talks about, I sinned and therefore I'm being punished, but also I'm being opposed by the wicked. And it's not that I did anything, it's just that the wicked people hate righteous people. And so save me because my enemies have risen up against me, but it has nothing to do with the covenant per se. It's you'll deliver me because of the covenant. So there is an element of covenant and wisdom, but it's also in some ways almost minimized in places, that the covenant can't just be the escape for everything or the explanation of everything. That it might be the solution, but it's not a flippant solution. It's okay, bad things are happening. What do I do? Well, God's covenant is that he will redeem me. Okay, I trust in that. It's not a fatalistic, deterministic, every day's going to be great.
The Pharisees messed that up.
Yes.
They think that the covenant is the easy solution. All I have to do is do it.
Right.
And they don't integrate any wisdom.
Yep.
Which, if they had,
Mm-hmm.
there would have been legalists.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and even then, when you get into the New Testament, there's the interaction with wisdom with Jesus, quoting several times from the Old Testament, but also talking about breaking the wisdom of the wise. But it's breaking a twisted form of wisdom, because he's not at all condemning the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament.
Really, Jonathan Pennington wrote a book that's basically saying, like, the Sermon on the Mount is wisdom literature. I
Yeah.
think it's in the same vein.
Huh.
I haven't read it, but
Yeah.
I'd like to read it.
He spoke at the ETS conference a few years ago
Mhm.
about that topic.
Yeah. Yeah, his book was Jesus the Great Philosopher.
Yeah. Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah, this is a very interesting idea to think of. Almost not so much, as we've said, not so much the prophets giving rise to wisdom literature, or even wisdom literature giving rise to the prophets, but that the prophets are part of the wisdom tradition that has always existed. Yeah. Trying to think off the top of my head, the word wisdom doesn't really show up until Exodus. It's not in Genesis at all.
It's weird. Look, I never realized until you said it, but doing the concordant search for Tariq, and you get past the Psalms and it just dries up. And the next thing you see is Isaiah, and it's like, whoa, where did Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon go? It's down there. Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, even Joseph. Well, there's a mention in Genesis 3:6 of pleasant to the eyes and desired to make one wise. The word is sakal, which can be prudent or have insight. And it shows up in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and even in Amos. The wise shall keep silence in that time, for it is an evil time.
Is Hokmah the normal word for?
Yeah, for wisdom, and hakam would be the verb form.
What's the word in Genesis 3 that Tree was desired to make one wise?
3:6, that's sakal. And that word shows up 63 times. So it's not the most common word, but it is very common. I usually take Hokmah in my mind as wise, sakal as clever, but they're probably not that much different to be prudent. Israel stretched out his right hand, laid it on Ephraim's head, who is the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands wittingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And the word is just sakal, sokale, prudently putting, or prudently his hand upon Manasseh and Ephraim. He switched it because he's wise, he's understanding. Deuteronomy 29:9, keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all you do, is how the King James Version translates it. Let's see. The ESV has a footnote, or deal wisely in all that you do. And eventually, by the time of, I just lost the guy's name, Ben Sira, which is also called Ecclesiasticus. I think that's right. Yeah, I think Ecclesiasticus is actually, that's not right. Ecclesiasticus, I think, is the one that's also called the Wisdom of Solomon. No, I was right. Ecclesiasticus is also Sirach, the book by Ben Sira. But by the time you get to Ben Sira and Ecclesiasticus, wisdom is the same as following the law, which, as Jeremiah has already pointed out with the Pharisees, it's not entirely the case. And Jesus kind of pokes holes in that theory. But that's how wisdom literature kind of shifted to wisdom is the law. Rather than a wise person follows the law, it's no, wisdom is the law. And I think in some cases, as you look at wisdom, even those classes on prophets, we spend all morning talking about wisdom. But the book of Exodus is also a lot about, and Leviticus is also a lot about wisdom, because it's case law, but it's case law that's supposed to be applied to non-mentioned cases. So here's some examples. Now go figure out the rest.
Right.
It's not exhaustive. Yeah.
Looks like the very first time Pokemon appears in the Bible is when God's calling out the artisans to build the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
He's giving them
Yeah.
artistic skill to do something. Like, here are the parameters, now go figure out how to build it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
you're tying into the law a skillful,
Mm-hmm.
artistic
Yep.
interpretation of the law for how to apply it in
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah. You could also tie in Genesis 1-3 with that, because one of the thoughts is that, well, God, by his wisdom, created the world. Therefore, artists, by their wisdom or by the wisdom of God, create other things. So even though it's not mentioned explicitly until Proverbs 8, the idea that God, by wisdom, created the world is assumed. So yeah, you can see how wisdom kind of interweaves itself through the whole Old Testament, which is pretty fascinating. So wisdom is even though it's not mentioned explicitly, it does affect the prophets to some degree, which again is part of why we would have to determine the parameters of how we define what is wisdom literature, because wisdom just doesn't, as a word, doesn't show up very often. So we'd have to explain, why does it not show up?
It could be, what is it to highlight a lack of wisdom to make you search for wisdom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, I've told you to be wise for this many years. You don't get it, so I'm just not going to talk about it. And when it gets really, really terrible, come find it. Search for it.
Yeah, it's almost as though when you get to the prophets, there's a condemnation of what wisdom has become. Obadiah picks on wise men. Zechariah picks on wise men. Jeremiah, they are wise to do evil. How do you say we are wise and the law is with us when it's not? The wise men are ashamed. Who is the wise man that may understand this? Who is he to whom the mouth of the Lord has spoken that he may declare it? For the land perishes and is burned up like wilderness. Send for the wise women that they may come. Send for the mourning women. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, nor the mighty man in his might. Who does not fear you, O King of the nations? For as much as among all the wise men of the nations and in their kingdoms, there is none like you. Silver is spread into plates in Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz, the work of the workmen. They are all the work of wise men. Let us devise devices against Jeremiah, for the law shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. A sword is upon the Chaldeans, and her wise men I will make her drunk, and her wise men shall sleep a perpetual sleep. So it's almost like we have a condemnation in Jeremiah. Same in Isaiah. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes, Isaiah 5:21. Where are the wise men, Isaiah 19:12. Isaiah 31, he also is wise and will bring evil, but will arise against the house of the evildoers and against the help of them that work iniquity. Isaiah 40, he is so impoverished that he has no gift He chooses a tree that will not rot. He finds a wise workman to prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. Isaiah 44, he frustrates the tokens of the liars. He makes diviners mad. He turns wise men backwards and makes their knowledge foolish. Yeah. So at least within, yeah, that's, and again with Micah has a condemnation upon the wise. So at least chronologically, if we were to consider this just in terms of chronology, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah are very big on condemning wisdom. And then the other late pre-exilic prophets and the post-exilic prophets don't really talk about it. And I wonder if that's because it has been so abused that it's not really mentioned. Same with Amos's, oh, don't call me a prophet, because prophecy has been so abused.
Is it, I wonder if there's almost like a pendulum swing going on with two extremes, like we even see in the church today. As the people who, there are people who just want to take the Mosaic civil law and say, well, we can just apply this one-to-one to our culture today. Just take it, make that the Constitution, we're good. And that doesn't show any wisdom for where we are with our culture.
Because then other people say, well, that means we ignore it all.
Exactly. Or even like the really wise people who are like, well, Paul says I don't permit a woman to teach, but here's my 30-page word study about how there's actually a woman in the church there.
Yes.
A woman, and he meets that woman, and
right.
In Ephesus, and so they use their wisdom to explain away everything they don't like.
Right.
Which is kind of what happened in Israel, where you had the people defending the idolatry, defending Asherah, and trying to claim wisdom for that.
Yeah.
And so you've got the wise people who are leading Israel astray because they're not really wise. But those are the ones the prophets are mocking.
Yeah.
Leading people away. And I think there was then that pendulum swing after the prophets, where by the time of the New Testament you've got this rigid wooden obedience to the law again with no room for wisdom. Where the Pharisees have all their rules, but then of course they have an equal for every rule. Right? Because no one can actually keep those rules, because those aren't even about rules. They're all of your laws you've made. So and no room for rules. So there's like the two sides where one person shows that trying to be wise can lead you into sort of liberalism, lead you away from the word. So the other side says, well, if that's the case, then we're not going to try to be wise at all. We're just going to woodenly apply this with no idea of wisdom.
Yeah.
And I saw a little bit of that even in our church with like the COVID stuff, where like every church, for the first 4 or 5 weeks we were online, we were Zooming because we don't want to all die.
Right.
But the elders didn't want to be responsible for, let's say we have 200 people in church, if 4% of those die, we just killed 8 people.
Yeah.
But we were pretty quickly back to drive-in services and then in-person services within a couple months. But there were the people in our church, a few families who were really upset, who were like, your job as the pastor is to have church every Sunday, period. And you try to reason with them, you're like, well, what if there's a snowstorm? We're just like, nope, that's your job. And if you die doing what God told you to do. Dang. That's what it is. I heard a guy kind of in a heated conversation talk. He's like, what do you want me to do? He's like, I want you to die. That's your job. Your job is to have church every Sunday, no matter what. Because Hebrews says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together.
Right.
And when you try to tell me, okay, that's not what that means. There's just no nope, that's the rule.
Yeah.
And so there's no wisdom at all. It's just, here's the rule. Yeah, it's kind of that.
It's one of the unfortunate things in the church. Dr. Van Gemeren used to always say that we're very good at teaching law, we're not good at teaching wisdom.
Yeah.
And that's very true. We don't really teach wisdom. So we teach rules.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, especially when it comes to sexuality, we have rules. And we just teach rules. Don't do this. Well, then when kids go off to college, they get given a different set of rules. And they have to evaluate which set of rules do I like. But we never taught them wisdom to explain why the set of rules are there in the first place. You know, we don't explain to them the whole relationship between Christ and the church and how sexuality is a consummation of a covenant. We don't teach covenant renewal ceremonies. We don't teach, we don't teach creation order. We don't teach, so a lot of these things that should just be common sense of, men are men and women are women seem pretty common. It seems like common sense, and yet, no, they don't. They don't know it because we haven't taught that. We've just told them homosexuality is bad. Well, why? Well, it just is. We haven't sat down and told them, look, it destroys the created order that's a reflection of Christ and the church. So, people can't articulate that. I was sitting with a group, I think of pastors, I'm trying to remember when it happened, but I just kind of brought it up almost in passing of, sex is like the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is the consummation of a relationship between Christ and his church that's celebrated on a regular basis. Sex is the covenant renewal ceremony between a husband and wife, Christ and the church, husband and wife. This is why all these things are wrong. They're like, oh, that's really good. I'm like, what? No, it's not. This is like basic Christianity. How do you not know this? This isn't some deep, profound thought. This is just the basics. And yet we don't teach that. We just teach, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, I mean, it's just, it's unfortunate of, why shouldn't I look at pornography? Oh, it rots your brain. Okay. Well, no, because Christ is not looking at pictures of the church. And actually we're forbidden from images. And the church doesn't look at pictures of Christ. Not supposed to. So, that should tell you something, but you have to make the connection. And we don't make connections. We don't explain wisdom. And in any area of our life of, a vocation or calling or finances, or we've just taught rules, 10%, it's gotta be 10%. Well, why is it 10%? Because that's what the word means. It means 10th. So you got to give your 10th. Okay. So then you got the guy who gives 10%, and he's like, I could give more, but, well, I only have to give a 10th. You're like, well, you can give more. And then you got the person who, has got the widow's mite and, just gives a penny. And you're like, well, as long as it's 10%, we're okay. And, no, maybe she wants to give all she lives on. And, so all of a sudden, we're no longer teaching wisdom. We're teaching law. And, even Malachi, God will bless you if you do this. Well, how about God has already blessed me and I'm doing this as a response? Oh, no, that's not what it says. Well, no, because it's old covenant. And we're in the new covenant. So what does tithing look like in the new covenant? It doesn't look like a number. It looks like a worshipful response to the gospel. And, in that sense, it could be more than 10. But it could also be less than 10 depending on situations. And, we don't have a law, but that's what we want. We want a law. Tell me how much. And I'm not going to give you a number, or I'll just look at people and say, 1 million, give me $1 million. We'll call it even. And that's one of the things that we struggle with is we want a number, we want a rule, we want a law, and wisdom doesn't give that. And ironically, to some point, the prophets even condemn not so much law, but they condemn just the easy, they condemn sacrifice, they condemn false religion, they condemn, they talk about justice, but not necessarily quoting a bunch of laws from the Old Testament. They seem to have more of a wisdom perspective of justice. Justice is, what's good for everybody, what's good for society, what's good for my neighbor. It comes out of love rather than just the application of a law. Justice in Israel is not necessarily what does the law say and we apply the law. But that's how we think. And the prophets are very careful to avoid that. So I think Rick is right. You almost get more of that perspective of Ben Sira of law is wisdom, and yet it's not really true. And it's unfortunate that he went there, but I think you see how he got there. Of we're not wise, we didn't follow the law, therefore if we follow the law, we'll be wise. And well, no, not really. Part of it, but that's not all of it. Because what if there's no rule? Well, we'll just make one. We'll make a fence around the law. And then we don't have to worry about breaking the law. And some of those laws that they have come up with are ridiculous. You know, if there's a guy naked on his roof and there's a woman sunning herself naked in the yard and he falls off the roof and lands on top of her, is that adultery? And I mean, that's in the law of dealing with, and they say, well, no, it's not. And I'm left with, what was he doing naked on his roof? That's not very wise. What were you doing on the roof? Obviously, you weren't tethered in, so there's some wisdom there to begin with. You shouldn't be falling off your roof. Where's the parapet that's supposed to be around the edge of your roof to keep you from falling off? Why were you on your roof to begin with? And why in the world did you do it naked? I mean, there's just so many wisdom things that play into this, and yet the law says, no, it's not adultery because he had no intent. And, my thought is, who cares what his intent was? He was an idiot. And, it should be condemned simply for stupidity's sake.
Yeah.
And yet that's not where the Pharisees go. They make a law. And because laws will protect people. Same with, there's a big discussion as to if you have something unclean next to the kitchen and something splatters from whatever you're cooking onto the unclean spoon, is it clean? And I mean, it's just this long debate about, well, if it lands on this first and then bounces, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's like, maybe you should just move the unclean thing. Like if that's what you're really concerned about, which is done to begin with. But let's say that you're really concerned about, I don't want to make this food unclean. Maybe you should have just moved all the unclean stuff away. I mean, if somebody were to say, so if I'm cooking myself an omelet and the egg splatters out of the pan and lands on the horse manure next to the pan, there should be a point at which you stop and say, why is there a pile of horse manure next to your pan on the stove? I mean, there's a wisdom issue here that is far more simple than let's debate what happens when it splatters out of the pan. Guys, this is a far easier solution. I think there's a guy on TikTok, I think his name's Kirby. He's made millions. He lives in Nigeria or Kenya. He lives in one of those. He's the second most popular TikToker in the world. And all he does is mock other people's TikToks. So, there's one where somebody has rolled up their shirt into the window of their car and they can't get out. So they show how to take a pair of scissors and to cut enough of the shirt that you can get out. And so he makes one where he does the same thing. He rolls it up and he reaches over and he opens the door, rolls the window down, pulls his shirt out, rolls it back up, and then goes. And that's his trademark thing. He's got this weird kind of smirk that he does. Yeah. But I mean, it's hilarious. But basically he's mocking people's stupidity, but they're just not very wise. And I mean, he's a multimillionaire now because of these TikToks, which is just hilarious because all he's doing is just pointing out of, you guys aren't very wise. There's one of my favorites is that there's a little Dixie cup and the person's pouring in the liquid. And so they show how to take another Dixie cup and tape it on top of the first Dixie cup to make a taller Dixie cup. And so he has the Dixie cup and he goes off screen. He comes back with a bigger glass and he sits it down next to it. And he takes the Dixie cup, and pours it into the glass. And you could just go get a bigger cup rather than going through all the effort of, So again, it's just, this isn't very wise. So yeah, you might be able to do this, but there's no wisdom involved in this. This is just dumb. And people are trying to make these viral TikToks, and he's going viral mocking them all, which is hilarious. But to some degree, you see the prophets doing that. Of guys, we're not even going to use the word wise because you've so violated what wisdom is. So in some ways, that you'd almost have to disagree with Von Rad in terms of prophecy did not give rise to wisdom literature. In some ways, wisdom literature arose despite prophecy because the prophets have kind of avoided it. Similar to did prophecy in Israel give rise to the classical prophets? Well, yeah, no, because the classical prophets seem to be more a reaction against how Israel understood prophecy. So that Amos doesn't want to use the term, he wants to avoid it, he doesn't want to call himself a prophet or the son of a prophet. Zechariah talks about how, people will not call themselves prophets. What happened to you? Oh, those are wounds from a friend, rather than I was in a, ecstatic prophecy experience. So, you've got these prophets that are arising as true prophets in the midst of false prophecy and ecstatic prophecy. And the same thing, you got the prophets that are in a sense kind of condemning what has become wisdom in Israel. But in their condemnation, they are almost avoiding the issue. So they don't really give rise to it. They just kind of ignore it and bypass it, which is a different way to look at it. That the prophets are reacting to wisdom rather than giving rise to it. Otherwise, if we were to make the case that the prophets give rise to wisdom literature, you would almost end up with more of a wisdom tradition between the time of the prophets and Christ. But you don't.
Yeah.
You end up with less of a wisdom tradition because even if you want to make the argument that all the wisdom literature is written late, still it's not applied. So you don't have people that are following this wisdom literature in the intertestamental period or after the return from exile. You've actually got people going more with Ben Sira and just saying, oh, well, just follow the law. That's wisdom. And it's all about rules. So you've actually got going in the opposite direction, which seems to be part of what the prophets are trying to get away from. So if the prophets give rise to wisdom literature, it was a complete and utter failure. And I would make the argument more of, no, we started with wisdom literature and things went downhill, and then the prophets are responding by their silence, responding to the lack of wisdom, which then leads to just follow the law and make a fence around the law. And Jesus has to come along and say, wisdom will be known by her deeds. You guys just aren't very wise. It's not what goes into a man that defiles him. It's what comes out of a man. But it's what comes out of a man, comes out of his heart. Come on, guys. Even as he says to Nicodemus, you're Israel's teacher. How do you not get this? Where's your wisdom? And Jesus presents himself, especially John, as the Logos, as wisdom incarnate. And really, and Jesus picks up on Proverbs 8 and really defines himself as wisdom. Jesus, the wisdom of God. So there's this fascinating pushback against what it's become. So Von Rad doesn't really fit in with the actual trajectory. So you can see it. You can see why Daniel, as an apocalypticist, is similar to wisdom literature, but at the same time, he's not the beginning of a new genre. It's a genre that already exists. And that might be, although within the prophets, he actually uses the word chokmah and wisdom more than any of the other prophets. So it's almost as though he's trying to pick up on wisdom literature and build off of it rather than respond to it or create a new genre. So there's a lot there to answer that question. Is Daniel wisdom literature? It's I still lean towards, sort of. But also understanding that it's a very loaded question because of all the stuff that has come before and how the prophets in general deal with wisdom. If you just say that anybody who uses the word wisdom is wisdom literature, then you'd have to say the prophets are not, because they don't use that term. But in some ways, they are trying to correct Israelite wisdom or lack thereof. Any thoughts or other comments on that?
No deep biblical thoughts, just thinking about the outworking of it.
Mm-hmm.
The building the hedge around the wall and how that works.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of my days of liberty, where you had all sorts of rules,
Yeah.
but it didn't really make you ungodly.
Yep.
So there's the rules like you can't watch a rated R movie, period. All rated R movies are off limits. So you can't watch The Patriot. But, you know, the guy in my dorm was watching like all the Austin Powers movies and like, you know, all this, you know, where it's like, that's totally okay because it's not R.
Right.
It's like, well, that's way more vile and, you know,
Oh, yeah.
and or like the rule like girls' skirts have to come down below their fingertips. And okay, that's great, but then you've got the girls who are wearing like the skin tight, like clingy dresses who are like way more immodest, you know, than you know, a girl with a slightly shorter skirt. So, you know,
Yep.
as soon as you make the rule, your mind goes to how to get around the rule. Versus, I mean, I don't even know what a Christian college would do. Just say, act like Christians. They expect you to behave like Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Use wisdom.
And then you use wisdom.
Yep.
But, you know, every rule that there was some exception to the rule that someone found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 We should be teaching modesty and those sort of things rather than enforcing a strict dress code. Yeah. 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 I mean, even when I was in college, we dressed different than they do now.
Yeah.
You know, the last time I went to Trinity, all the college students were just in sweatpants and stocking caps and clearly hadn't showered in a few days.
Yeah.
And I was kind of horrified at the level of hygiene or lack thereof, even among the girls. Looking around, I'm like, wow, this is awful. You know, we were at Covenant a couple weeks ago, and there's no dress code, official dress code there. And there were a couple of people I was like, oh, that's pushing the limits. But yet those same people would probably be pushing the limits if there was a dress code. And so, you know, okay, we're not going to have a dress code. We're going to teach wisdom of this is why we dress a particular way. And then we're going to, and even if we do have a dress code, it's not the end all. You know, we don't necessarily have to get rid of rules altogether, but at the same time, we have to teach wisdom. So, you know, we have speed limits, but speed limits are also wise. And to teach wisdom, that there are times the speed limit says a number that I'm not gonna go. I'm gonna go a different number. In fact, there are times even when we break speed limits for the sake of wisdom. You know, if you're in your car at 2 a.m. and your wife's in labor, you're not stopping at red lights.
Yeah.
You're going to slow down. You're going to go. You know, when I'm running a fire call at 2 a.m., I don't stop. I slow down for red lights, but I've got a little light that goes on the top of my car that I usually flip on if I'm going to run a red light. But, you know, I went to a fire in Cave Spring and, you know, there was a cop sitting there. I slowed down, went right through and flipped my little red light on. He didn't move. He watched me go through. I think he knew I was going to that fire. But, you know, that's a wisdom issue of I'm needed at the fire scene because something tragic has happened. They need a chaplain. They don't need me sitting at a red light at 2 a.m. when there's no traffic. I mean, there's nobody else on the road except me and that cop. He's sitting in a parking lot. So, you know, he'd probably be sitting there thinking, that guy's an idiot. If I were to sit at the red light for 10 minutes waiting for it to go green, it just makes much more sense to go through it. So, you know, even there, we think in terms of not just rules, but wisdom. Police officers don't follow the speed limit. And there's a wisdom reason for that. There's also wisdom reason as to why they should follow the speed limits at other times. I heard there was a cop in Wisconsin that was speeding on his way to work. He wasn't even in his squad car yet. And a pastor friend of mine actually followed him to work and complained to him, went up and explained to him why it was necessary for him to follow the speed limit when he was in uniform. And even in his squad car, why he needed to follow, be close to the speed limit. A friend and I had a discussion. He's a cop, and he and I had a discussion, and I was making the argument that I think it's good that the state patrol goes a little faster than the rest of the traffic. One, if they go the speed of the rest of traffic backs up, because then they won't pass the cop. But two, then you're with the same group of 6 cars the whole time. And unless you're going to get the idiot who's going to come flying down the highway and try to pass you all, there's places he needs to be. There, so for him to go 5, 6, 7 more than everybody else, I don't have a problem with that. But my friend who's a cop said that he disagreed. He said, no, I think the cop needs to set the example, and he needs to drive at the speed he wants everybody else to drive. And yeah, it's going to back up behind him. So, if it's a 70 and he's going to go 77, well, that's fine. But whatever he's going to start pulling people over for, he shouldn't go any faster. He shouldn't be going 83 and then pulling people over for going 83. So even he had a different take on it, which I think is part of what bothers us, because we want to rule. Well, what is it?
Right.
What's the rule? When I was a youth pastor, I would get asked all the time, how far is too far? That was always the classic question, and I would always tell them, you do realize you're asking that question because you want to go as far as you possibly can. Yeah. And get away with it. Yeah. So whereas wisdom would say you should actually be as restrictive as you're comfortably possible. And even the kids on the softball team just thought it was hilarious that I'd never kissed a girl until I kissed my wife, and when we got engaged. And they're like, oh, they just thought that was the most bizarre thing ever, that I had not kissed a girl at all until that point. It was just like, well, that was a decision that I made. I didn't think it'd be wise. And so, we got engaged, and I kissed her. It's interesting. I talked to my dad about it, and one of the things that he said was that he did not think that it was wise until you wait to your wedding day to kiss, because he said there's a level of intimacy when you kiss someone that has an emotional impact on the relationship. And he said there are things you need to talk about before you get married that require a certain level of intimacy. And having actually kissed each other can actually open up some level of intimacy that you're willing to talk about certain things. Almost, you've kind of, broken the glass ceiling, as it were. Yeah. So he said, yeah, there's a wisdom of, okay, well, we want to have these conversations, so let's do all this. No, we're not going there. Right. But at the same time but even that's a wisdom issue. Sure. Of, do I know myself? Do I know my own proclivities? Do I know,
like it'll be different for different people.
Yeah. I counseled a couple, and they're like, yeah, when we're, when it's late at night and we're down watching a movie in the basement and nobody's home, purity's hard. Like, yeah, well, yeah, I understand that. So,
use
wisdom. Yeah. And so I explained to them, maybe you should even tell your parents that you're struggling with this, so that they don't let you go down in the basement to watch a movie, just the two of you. Oh, I never thought of that. Right? Yeah. Well, that's what I'm here for. That's why we're doing premarital counseling. So, even that, it's a wisdom issue, but we tend to teach just laws of, don't come and tell me that you're pregnant, and we'll just call it even. And, that's kind of where we draw the line. And yet, there actually might be some wisdom of not doing these things. And there might be some wisdom of doing these things. People, classic question, is gambling a sin? Not necessarily. You can maybe make the argument about being a bad steward of your money. It's just not wise. It's a bad use of the funds that God has given you to be a steward of. The house always wins. It's rigged. They would go out of business if you always won. Right. So, there's a wisdom issue here. Same with alcohol. A lot of these fringe issues of, should I drink? Well, should you drink? I mean, even just the question, you make it sound like it's something you have to do. You know, can I drink? Can I? Well, even there's a wisdom issue of, you know, where are you? Why are you drinking? What, you know, all of these various things. There are certain instances where the answer is no, you shouldn't. There are certain instances where the answer, it might actually be yes. You know, I went to Ukraine and we had to sign something that said if we went with a mission of the world, we would not drink or smoke or whatever. And then we went to Ukraine and we all drank because that's the culture. And they put vodka in front of us and wanted us to try it and would have been deeply offended had we not. Yeah. And so, you know, to be like, well, you know, I signed this thing that said that I wouldn't, and I tasted it because, you know, that was what culturally they wanted us to do. And so, you know, even there's sometimes actually situations where you should drink.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, you were talking a few weeks ago. You know, someone gives you a plate of meat. They tell you where the meat's from, don't eat it. But they give you a plate of meat. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You know, if somebody tells you, hey, we're going to go see this movie. Okay, sure. If they go out of their way to tell you all the bad stuff that's in it, don't go see the movie. Yeah. But it's a wisdom issue, and there's no hard and fast rule, but we want rules. And,
yeah. There's this song that often comes to mind. It's by Derek Webb. You guys know him?
Keaton's Call.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And he had a solo career that was fascinating. I mean, his music is kind of prophetic in the sense that it's not popular. It pushes back against a lot of Christian culture. But he, more recently, in the past couple of years, renounced the faith and wrote an album about leaving the faith. Now an atheist, but on staff at a very liberal church. So all very interesting.
Staff at a church.
He is an atheist on staff at a church. So that tells you a little bit about what that church is like. But anyways, I say all that to say, during the sweet spot of his career there, where he was kind of like pushing back against church stuff, he wrote a song called New Law. And it's like he brings up all these different examples of ways that we just want a new law.
Oh yeah.
And so the chorus is, I don't want to know if the answers aren't easy, just bring it down from the mountain to me. And I thought it was really profound.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. There's good lyrics too. It's very interesting.
Huh.
I remember a story about Douglas Wilson out of New St. Andrews. There's a group of guys, and you see this in every college. The troublemakers all find each other the first week. So there's always a small group of them. They always find each other right away. But yeah, there are these college freshman guys who are like, we're 18, we can smoke cigarettes now. Come down to their parents' house, and they're like the bad boys, packing cigarettes everywhere. And he called them into his office and said, you can't do that. And they're like, well, you smoke. Other people here smoke. You saying it's a sin to smoke cigarettes? It's like, it's not a sin to smoke cigarettes, but it is a sin for you to smoke cigarettes.
Right, yeah.
It's a sin for you to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah.
You know, the point was, you're doing it because you know this would make your parents mad.
Right.
And you just want to be rebellious. So there's nothing wrong with the cigarette. It's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah.
And that's, that's kind of that. I remember that. I remember that phase, like my sophomore year of college. I had become a Calvinist my freshman year, and I discovered Christian liberty. It was like, you can't tell me not to do this or that unless you
Yep, that's right.
You're off to the races with like, I can do whatever I want if there's not a verse that says I can't do it.
Yep. Yeah.
It took some wise people to speak into my life and say, look, that's not the point. That's the point you're misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Right. That's my job a little bit, because people kind of know I'm the Christian, and they'll always ask me like, should I drink? And I'm like, well, sure. And there's this one particular girl who spends about $500 a month on alcohol. And she's like, I was like, listen, I'm all for taking a beer, but like maybe $50 a month. And that was the whole thing. They're like, oh, so you drink? It's like, yeah. It's just,
it means something different.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. $500 a month is pretty extreme. Yeah. That is a lot.
Has a when your other friends that drink tell you should stop drinking, that's when you
That's a
know.
sign.
That's when you know.
Yes. Yeah, all your fellow alcoholics tell you you should stop. Yeah. Well,
That's the prophets, isn't it? Also,
Yeah.
telling the people that doesn't want your sacrifices.
Yeah. Stop it.
He's
Yeah.
disgusted by you.
Yeah, but
You
you-
told me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not that way.
Yeah. 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 Well, what? Okay, so kind of what I want to chat about now is we've talked about wisdom literature and prophets. One of the things I love about doing the discussion based is that things take far longer than I thought they would, or things go far shorter than I thought they would, and so you never know where the conversation is going to go. So that's fun. There's a question, or I don't know if you would call it a question, maybe a theory about how do we read the 12? Do we read them as 12 separate books, or do we read them as 12 books together? There are two major ideas in this question. One of them comes from James Nogalski, Nogalski, Nogalski. Sometimes it's just J.D. Nogalski, rather than spelling out his name as James D. Pretty much any book I've come across on the minor prophets mentions him, because he does a lot of work on the minor prophets. One of the things that he emphasizes is that the 12 go together. He says they were written on a single scroll and counted as a single book from at least 200 BC, according to him. And he then goes through and talks about how there are seams between the books in terms of stock vocabulary that shows up in each book. So he talks about the fact that there are direct citations in particular books. So he gives Joel 4:16 as a quotation of Amos 1:2. And then also Obadiah seems to repeat some of the structural elements of Amos 9, at least in the evidence that he shows. And Obadiah also seems, in his mind, to quote Jeremiah 49:9 and Jeremiah 49:14 through 16. Let me. So 49:9, if grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? If thieves came by night, would they not destroy only enough for themselves? And then I have heard a message from the Lord, and an envoy has been sent among the nations. Gather yourselves together, come against her, rise for battle. I'll make you small among the nations, despised among mankind. The horror you inspire has deceived you. Pride of your heart, you who live in the clefts of the rock, who hold the height of the hill. Though you make your nest as high as the eagles, I will bring you down from there. And then verse 3 of Obadiah 1, verse 2, I will make you small among the nations, you'll be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock. Verse 5, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed, would they not steal enough only for themselves? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? And so Nagalski wants to make the argument that that there are deliberate allusions and connections between Obadiah and Jeremiah. Of course, as we've talked, it's sometimes difficult to know who's quoting who. But then he moves on from there, not only to connect Obadiah to Jeremiah, but then to connect Obadiah to Amos chapter 9. So Amos 9. Let's see here. Obadiah 1 through 5 shows a remarkable tendency to imitate the structural components of Amos 9, 1 through 15 by modifying the quotation from Jeremiah. At least that's his opinion. I'll make you small among the nations. And then the idea of hiding themselves. Not sure I quite see it as much as he wants to make the argument, which is part of what I'll get to in a moment. And then he also notes connections between Joel and Amos. That Joel 4:16 is a quotation of Amos 1:2.
Joel 3:16?
4:16. And he says there are several possibilities that could explain the citation. One, maybe it's an accident, although he says rationale would all but preclude this possibility. Given the probability that Joel 4 quotes Amos and not the other way around, one should consider two additional possibilities. Two, Joel quotes Amos, but the citation functions apart from the literary horizon of the 12. Or three, Joel deliberately anticipates Amos as part of the book of 12.
What is this in Joel again?
Joel 4:16.
It says it's 4 chapters in Hebrew, but it's like 3.
Oh,
Yes.
that makes sense. It's like three chapters.
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry.
That makes sense. That was really
Yep. So let's see. It would be, let's see what verse.
The Lord roars from Zion. Voice from Jerusalem.
Oops, why is this not? Here we go. So it would actually be. Did I say 9:1? Is that what I said?
For
16.
For Amos.
Oh, for Amos.
Oh, 1:2, sorry. Yeah, the Lord roars from Zion. You're right. Yep.
So 3:16, 1:2.
Yep. So he wants to draw a connection there, and then let's see here. Joel 4:16 could be strengthening the Jerusalem orientation of the 12 books, particularly since the books on either side of Joel, Hosea and Amos, focus on the fate of the northern kingdom. Joel focuses on Jerusalem, but anticipates, in quotes, Amos by quoting one of the less numerous Jerusalem texts in Amos, encourages the reader of the 12 not to forget to read Amos in light of Joel. One would then expect to find other touchstones between the two writings which would assist in this process. For example, there's an eschatological judgment against the nations in Joel 4 that is similar to Amos 1 and 2. There's locust imagery of Joel 1 that is similar to Amos 4:9. So he wants to say that Joel uses intertextuality and deliberately frames the oracles against Jerusalem, against the nations in Amos 1:2 as part of Yahweh's ongoing actions against his people. Simultaneously, the explanation of the identity of Yahweh's people for whom Yahweh will be a refuge develops rather more subtly across the 12. So those are quotations. Then he wants to move on to allusions and talk about how there are deliberate allusions between particular books. Let me see if he gives an example here. So the 12 periodically alludes to locusts as invading armies as part of Joel, but elsewhere he wants to find it. Amos 9, Haggai 2, 2:19, Zechariah 8:12. And then not only does he have direct quotations, not only does he have allusions, but then he wants to talk about catchwords. So these catchwords appear in the seams, that is the concluding and opening passages of the writings of the 12. For instance, Hosea ends with inhabitants. Joel begins with inhabitants. Hosea ends with vine. Joel opens with vine. Hosea ends with wine. Joel opens with wine. Hosea ends with grain. Joel opens with grain. Even though the words do not convey the same message, for instance, Hosea 14 is positive, whereas Joel 1 is negative, but they use the catchwords to connect the two books. Let's see if he gives another example here. And then he wants to say the same. He says, Yahweh's speeches in Malachi 3 reference the language of Joel. From the days of your fathers, you've turned aside from my statutes and not kept them. Return to me and I will return to you, says Yahweh Sabaoth. And then at the end of Malachi, bring the full tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, says Yahweh Sabaoth, to see whether I will open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you until there's no sufficiency. I will rebuke the devourer for you so that it will not destroy the fruit of your soil, and the vine of the field will not stop producing for you. It is interesting, he says, how many times the devourer in Malachi has been treated as locust, so that you have an allusion then, or catchword, between Joel chapter 1 and the end of Malachi. And then his fourth thing is themes and motifs, in terms of these various ideas. In fact, he even says that superscriptions play a key role in the structure of the 12. 6 superscriptions provide the chronological framework to the 12 and represent the largest group. The superscriptions of Hosea, Amos, Micah, Zephaniah, Haggai, and Zechariah all contain chronological indicators, and very significantly, all 6 appear in a literary constructed chronological order. So Hosea talks about Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Jeroboam. Amos talks about Uzziah, Jeroboam. Micah talks about the middle three, doesn't mention Uzziah or Jeroboam, talks about Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and then Zephaniah talks about Hezekiah and Josiah, and leaves out the rest of them. In the 12, portrayals of theophanies of judgment begin or end 4 successive works. Micah begins with a portrayal of theophany. Nahum begins with a theophany. Habakkuk concludes with a theophany. Zephaniah begins with a theophany. All 4 contain at least hints of universal judgment. Habakkuk chapter 1 utilizes catchwords and words to point back to Nahum. So he's on the one side. And then the other guy, his name is Ehud ben Zvi, Z-V-I. Ehud ben Zvi, great Jewish name. And he argues for the complete opposite. He argues that there are no seams and that there is no proposal. He's arguing against Nogalski. He's also arguing against Paul House, who wrote a book called The Unity of the 12, which does not go into the meticulous detail of Nogalski, but same idea. House, I think, has a very weak argument. House wants to base it purely on themes, and that the themes of the 12 are opened up in Hosea 1 through 3, and that the rest of the prophets unpack that. So then he takes each one of the prophets and ties it into Hosea chapters 1 through 3. So Obadiah elaborates on the sin of hating one's neighbor. In Jonah, the heathen characters are sinful. The fortunes of Israel and the rest of the creation begin to plunge downward in Hosea and Joel, fail in Amos and Obadiah, and begin to inch upwards towards the end of Zephaniah. However, Ben Zvi says, none of these positions is likely to have developed if the authors, this Paul House, if his strategy of analysis would have been to study each prophetic book separately. If Obadiah is read as a complete literary unit in and of itself, one is very likely, or is less likely, to characterize the text as an elaboration on "you shall love your neighbor as yourself." In Jonah, the sailors are not characterized in a negative light, nor are they condemned for praying to their own gods. If one reads Hosea, Joel, Amos, and Micah as separate books, one is likely to reach the conclusion that each of these books is written so as to convey the image that the fortunes of Israel will not only inch upwards, but ascend to the highest level imagined within the discourse of the period. Of course, it's because of these conclusions of the prophetic books that a long tradition of interpretation understood each of these books as a message of hope and salvation. And then let me see if he's got one where I think he specifically argues against Nogalski. He says, the Book of 12 can be read as a unit if one chooses such a reading strategy. But from this obvious observation, it does not follow that the ancient Judite writers and readers responsible for the prophetic literature present in the Hebrew Bible actually followed that strategy. It certainly does not follow from this observation that the 12 prophets were intentionally written or edited so as to convey a sense of close unity among them that set them apart as a unit from the other prophetic books. The earliest evidence that strongly suggests the writing of the 12 in one scroll is from about 150 BC. Even if, for the sake of argument, one were to grant that Sirach suggests this arrangement, the fact remains that this evidence seems significantly later than the date of composition of the prophetic books. So for the reasons mentioned, this evidence is not helpful for the study of composition or for reconstructing the way in which these prophetic books were read and reread with the communities within which and for which they were written. So, okay, 150 BC, sure, but they weren't written in 150 BC. They were written much earlier. Even if, for the sake of argument, one were to grant that the 12 books were produced in the form of a single roll since the Achaemenid period, or even earlier, it does not follow that they had to be read as a unified literary unit. Collections of works did exist in antiquity, as the book of Proverbs with its underlying collection clearly shows, but there is ample evidence, although from a later time, that clearly falsifies the idea that one scroll must mean one reading strategy, namely that of reading the scroll as a unified literary unit. For instance, the Pesharim from Qumran provide an obvious example of ancient communities who were aware of the fact that the 12 prophetic books were written in one scroll and yet still considered them separate works. Later on, rabbis and the Masoretic tradition, both of which were clearly aware of the 12 being written in one scroll, indicate an understanding of the Book of 12 as a collection of books rather than a unified book. The fact that there seems not to be a completely fixed order for the books undermines the hypothesis that they were communally accepted and that the main strategy was reading one book. Otherwise, people have to claim that the strategy of reading them as one book was discarded and that by the time of the Septuagint, it was forgotten and that we have somehow reclaimed that. One can find some allusions and some parallel texts and thematic similarities among the prophetic 12 in the book of 12, but also among many of these prophetic books and the 3 prophetic books that are not included in the book of 12, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And nobody is suggesting that we should read them as the book of 15 rather than the book of 12. Quotations, allusions, thematic links, and the like can be found also between some of the 12 books and non-prophetic texts in the Hebrew Bible. So it's highly questionable if these literary features per se must be explained in terms of unified readings. So to evaluate the claim that the books included in the book of 12 were written so as to lead to reading the book of 12 as one unit, one must examine both the presence of inner allusions, parallel texts, shared stylistic devices, common themes, discontinuities of style, perspective, and even ideology among the same text. Both types of features may function as textually inscribed markers influencing the understanding of the text. So the most significant and unequivocal evidence, namely that the titles of the books set them on the same level with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel as separate books. There is no heading, no introduction that can serve to tell readers that they must read the book of 12 as one, which seems odd. So those are the 2 different approaches. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got Nagalski and House. House wants to base it on the themes of Hosea and say, Hosea is the intro. Here's how all these different books relate to this overall theme from Hosea. Nagalski wants to come along and base it on words and base it on the connection between various chapters, which the technique that Nagalski is using is not, it's not an unusual technique. Robert Alter uses it many times to connect chapters in Genesis. Joseph goes out to see his brothers. They throw him in a pit. They take the robe. They dip it in blood. They come to Jacob and they say, "See this robe? Whose is this?" And Jacob says, "Oh, my son's been torn to pieces." Next chapter, Judah is out doing what Judah does, and Tamar takes his signet ring and other things and comes out and says, "Whose are these?" And he goes, "Oh, you're more righteous than me." And then Potiphar's wife takes Joseph's coat again and says, "Whose is this?" So, you've got this connection of identification based on objects that are connected to a person. And Alter does a really good job of showing how the Judah story is deliberately placed in between the Joseph story. That here you got Joseph saving the family, and you got Judah that's pretty much just given up on the family. And Tamar is the one that has to come along and save the line of Judah.
while Joseph is in Egypt saving the Israelites. So, Joseph and Tamar are very much linked in those instances, which is fascinating. So Nagalski wants to make the same argument then in the prophets. He wants to say, so we've got these words that show up in the first couple chapters and these words that show up in the end of the chapters, see they're linked. And he wants to base it on the allusions, the use of vocabulary, stock vocabulary, the use of quotations. Then you got Ben Zvi, on the other hand, who says, well, that's great, but the words that you've used are so common that you could find quotations between the minor prophets and the major prophets. You could also find allusions from the minor prophets to the major prophets. So does that mean that we should read the book of 15 rather than the book of 12? And nobody ever says that you should read them as one. So the fact they all end up on a single scroll, does that really mean that we should read them that way? You could ask a similar question about 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, because in the tradition originally, it was 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kings. And the Septuagint broke them up into 4 sections because they wouldn't all fit on one scroll. So we had 2 scrolls for 1st and 2nd Kings, 2 scrolls for 3rd and 4th Kings. But 3rd and 4th Kings became 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st, 2nd Samuel was originally 1st and 2nd Kings. So, even there, we've made some decisions, but nobody reads them that way. And yet at the same time, we kind of read them all that way. The writer of Kings seems to be very similar to the writer of Samuel, and potentially even the writer of Judges. So that, the hypothesis that the same guy wrote Judges, Samuel, and Kings is not as far-fetched as it might be. Although I tend to think that the writer of Judges and the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel and maybe the first 3 chapters of Kings are the same guy, but that from there on it's somebody different because it's just a slight change, not a huge one, but a slight change. But nobody's really uncomfortable with that idea, but nobody really, I don't know, makes the argument that you have to read them together and that you can't read them separate. So for Nagalski to come along and say, you have to read them together, can't read them separate, they were always intended to be read together, is to make the argument then that Judges was always to be read with 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel obviously knows about Judges, and I think Judges is written in a Davidic era when it wants to make Saul look bad. But beyond that, there's as you're reading Judges, you kind of get the sense of he knows about David.
Yeah.
But when you're reading Samuel, he doesn't quote from Judges. There'd be, aside from mentioning Gibeon, and mentioning, who is his father, if you really wanted to tie Judges and Samuel together, you would say, who is his mother? Because it's the mom that was the one who was kidnapped, not the father. So you would make fun of his mother, not his father. The only one who ever makes fun of his mother is Saul. Saul makes fun of Jonathan's mother, Saul's wife. There's no other mocking of Saul's pedigree, or there's just kind of this, well, we know what happened in Gibeon, wink, wink. But beyond that, there's never a direct reference to it. You just have to know Israelite history. So even then, do the books go together? Well, sure. Do they have to be read together? No. So, that's really what we're left with the minor prophets is it's 12. You could read them together, but do they have to be read together? What would be, at least in your mind, what would be the what would be kind of the via media, the halfway, the compromise between the two positions, and what value would it bring to the reading of the minor prophets?
Yeah, I was gonna say why can't there be a little bit of both?
How we read scripture.
Yeah.
66 books is one book, but there are 66 books.
Yep.
And it doesn't have to.
There's value.
One doesn't necessarily cancel the other out.
Right.
Yeah.
And usually both interpretations you end up with are not. It just shows the thickness of the meaning.
Right.
Like if you were to read them as 12 and read them as individual books, they wouldn't contradict each other. You would just have a thicker meaning, which was already there.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, there's so the two of these guys, Nagalski and
Zvi got together and wrote a book called Two Sides of the Same Coin. Oops, I downloaded that twice. Not sure how I did that. And then another guy came along. Trying to find where it is. I know I got it. Here it is. Francis Landy, Landy. And he wrote Three Sides of a Coin in conversation with Ben Zvi and Nagolsky. The original book was Two Sides of a Coin, juxtaposing views on interpreting the Book of 12, the 12 prophetic books. So he presents this, I don't know that he ever really comes out and says what he thinks.
What's Landy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found it on Liberty's website. On there.
Is it a book or an article?
Article.
Or journal?
Yep. Yeah, it's in Journal of Hebrew Scriptures from 2010. Yeah, I had Three Sides of a Coin, and it popped up on the. I couldn't get the Two Sides of a Coin one, disappointingly. The other question is, at least within the structure of the 12, you can also make the argument, as Nagolsky does, that Nagolsky is trying to say that it was edited later. A redactor did this.
Which seems like a little bit of a stretch.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's picking verses that are in the flow of.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like it's almost the difference between reading from a biblical theology perspective, which is reading from a canonical perspective.
Yeah.
This is the canon, so we're going to read it as such.
Yeah.
Versus this is the way it fell out in real time as it was written.
Right.
But maybe someone like Nagolsky would say, it doesn't matter how it fell out in real time because we can't know that. We can only know the final edited file.
Yep.
Right.
I think so, yeah.
So you got those two.
Yeah. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that I don't think Nagolsky or Zvi are Christians.
That's so crazy.
So, they're debating this. Michael Shepard wrote a paper. What's the name of his paper? Compositional Analysis of the 12. He wrote it in 2008, which is actually, I'm trying to think when Nagolsky and Zvi wrote their book. But so he writes, if I can get my thing to load here. A compositional approach to the Book of 12 takes seriously the historical reality of the book's literary unity. Composition of the 12 is just as much an historical act as any other, and the historical dimensions of the text have not been treated adequately until the text has been interpreted as a whole. The internal evidence of the book's composition corroborates the external evidence cited at the outset of this article about the 150 BC and all that. A compositional strategy can be followed through which the reader is given an eschatological and messianic message. Which, if you read the books separately, what kind of message would you end up with? Messianic. So there comes a point at which, it's a fascinating discussion, and actually Shepard's paper, which I also got off of Liberty's website, is actually more detailed even than Nagolsky. Although Nagolsky has a book that he goes through all this on. I've not read the book, but he works through, Shepard works through each of the end of one chapter in the beginning, or the end of one book in the beginning of the next. And he goes through all the minor prophets. The problem is, again, that he's using the traditional order.
So what would be a fascinating study would be if you took the various parts of, the various books, shuffled them up, threw them out on the table, and then tried to find seams between them based on the randomness of the books. Could you make the argument? I'm kind of left thinking of, you ever watched Pink Floyd or listened to Pink Floyd while you're watching Wizard of Oz? That was the big thing when I was in college, that you start playing Pink Floyd. I think it's The Dark Side of the Moon. You start playing that album at a particular point in the movie, at least on record, and then everything lines up. So as she goes like this, and you hear this airplane go over it. And Pink Floyd claims they didn't do it on purpose. And I believe them, because it stops after a certain point, in theory. We let it keep running just to see what would happen. And we found all sorts of connections between the record and the rest of the movie. That there's just certain sounds that line up.
Yeah.
And yet, it kind of reminds me a little bit, there's a meme going around online. It's a guy mooning the television, and you kind of see him from the front mooning the television. And it's a scene from Friends where the two women in the background are going, and so that's the background of them looking at his butt going, but nobody would suggest that the writers of Friends were doing that. And it's become a popular meme that all sorts of people do it with all sorts of different things. And, just because it's a funny scene. But the writer of Friends, I don't even remember what they were looking at in the show.
Chandler and Monica, they found out they were dating for the first time.
Okay.
They saw them making out.
Yeah. So, there you've got the shocked look on their faces as they see what's going on. So, you can't really line it up, but you could.
Right. Yeah.
And you're kind of left the same with the minor prophets of, if you read it in a particular way, you're going to get the same message as if you don't read it that way.
Right.
So, if you read the minor prophets properly, you're going to get the same message. And we should expect that because it's the same God who's inspired all of it. Right? So, of course, you're going to get the connections in the seams. So, I'm not saying that there aren't seams. To some degree, it almost comes out as somewhat irrelevant.
Yeah, feels like it doesn't make a whole lot of difference.
The confession points that up too. Meaning is one.
Yes.
Not manifold.
Yep.
Meaning may be thick. There's
Mhm.
one meaning.
That's right.
So you shouldn't be reading it a different way to find another meaning.
Yep.
Because then it probably would be with the reader then.
Right.
I assume.
Yeah. And that's the tricky part of so much of what we assume about Scripture affects our reading. But they are basically making the assumption that if you don't read it as a literary unit, that you will not read any of the books in light of another. That unless we can prove that Hosea, Joel, Amos were connected literarily and that there's seams between the books, you won't read Hosea, Joel, and Amos together. And yet we read Hosea, Joel, and Amos together.
Which I guess is where you say their non-Christian presuppositions.
Yes.
To a point, because we're already doing that because we're presupposing that it's
Yeah.
connected by inspiration.
Right.
Where they're trying to pull out connections that you really don't need.
Yep.
They can be helpful,
You don't have to convince
but
Yes.
we already think the whole thing's.
Yeah.
So of course
Yep.
we're going to read it in light of the rest of the books,
Yeah.
but we don't need a textual evidence in order to do that,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose.
Yeah. So for them to even make the argument that the Deuteronomistic history runs from Deuteronomy through Kings, to some degree is fascinating discussion, but irrelevant. Is the writer of Deuteronomy the author of Joshua? I don't think so. Does it really affect how I read the book? No. Even the authorship debates that go on in the New Testament,
they only really interest me because it says it's Paul, and it's not lying to me. So I have a vested interest to make sure that people think it's Paul. But other than that, does it really matter to me who the writer of Hebrews is? No. It's an interesting discussion. There's certain tidbits that I think you can pick up in places. There's at least one place where somebody refers to the author, or he refers to himself as a male rather than a female. But other than that, somebody said to me the other day, I think Apollos wrote it. It's like, okay. Sure, you can say whatever you want. I mean, you can say Bob wrote it. It doesn't make a difference to how I read it. Is it somebody who was influenced by Paul? Yes. Is it somebody who understands Jewish theology? Yes. Is it somebody who knows Timothy? Yes. Beyond that, it doesn't matter. And so does it matter to me that Hosea said what Hosea said? Yes. Does it matter to me that Joel knows about Hosea when he writes Joel? Not really. So, I mean, yeah, there's allusions and there are these seams, but that shouldn't really surprise us. There's allusions in the New Testament that go back to the Old Testament. That doesn't surprise me either. Does it surprise me that there are overlaps between Revelation and Daniel? No. Does it surprise me that there are references between temple theology and the things that Paul says? No. So, as fascinating of a discussion as it is, at some point it's just irrelevant. Because I'm going to read them as not even the 12. I'm going to read them as the 15. I'm going to read them as the 39. I'm going to read them as, what they are. Because they're all inspired by the same God. They're all part of the same Bible. But, you're right. They don't have that, they don't have that vested interest in preserving any integrity between the text.
Right. Yeah, because whereas we have an eye out for marks of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what their thoughts are on inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
We see, we can easily point out all the marks when it comes to each book, which is why we accept them.
Mm-hmm.
With them, they have to read it into it almost. It feels like they have to force a connection into it to think that they're together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can't have a supernatural explanation.
Which is, they're Jewish, it sounds like. So you would think they would believe in a supernatural element.
Yeah, well, that's what disappointed me with Alter, because you get the impression that he does, and then to find out that he doesn't is very disappointing. But some of these guys, same thing. They're Jewish, but it's just a book.
Yeah.
It's not.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, Israel has really become a secular state. Which is really sad.
Yeah.
I got to go use the bathroom again. There's a lot of differences between Jesus as a prophet and the Old Testament prophets. The one that jumps out to me the most is the use of parables and signs. Why does Jesus use parables and signs?
One of the reasons is so that those who are not supposed to understand wouldn't understand. I think he says that. So that the blind will remain blind and the deaf.
Which I guess is kind of similar to.
That's Isaiah, right?
It is.
Seeing and not seeing.
Yep. He quotes that. And yet you don't really see anywhere in the Old Testament prophets where they specifically say, I'm doing parables and signs to keep it hidden. It basically, it does make the assumption you're not going to get it, but it doesn't ever really come out and say, you're not going to get it because I'm going to keep it hidden.
Because when Isaiah does the signs, or maybe it was Isaiah and Ezekiel, seems like they declare to the people pretty clearly what they're signifying, and people are just so blind that even when they say that, I think we went over it last time, the point of the signs was to get through to the people because the words weren't cutting it, and Christ kind of flips it as a sign so that I keep it from you. But I am telling you so that it's your fault for not getting it, but I didn't want you to get it anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
So whereas the prophets are like, well, you're not going to listen to me speak, so I'll let it go. And maybe you'll get it then.
Yeah.
Well, that's for the parables, but Jesus does signs too, right?
Yeah.
The book of John, you've got 7 signs.
Yep.
Everyone is accompanied by a teaching.
Yes.
So I feed the 5,000, and then I tell you, now you know what? I'm the bread from heaven. says.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then they'll.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he does. That's very prophetic.
Uh-huh.
The sign and teaching company.
Yeah. Yeah, it's mostly just the parables that are.
Yeah. And Jesus, he could have ended all disease and world hunger, but he didn't.
Right.
His miracles were very specific and very targeted to teach things.
Yeah.
They weren't just let's heal everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Jesus, I think something else he does different is, normally with the prophets, you have, thus saith the Lord. And Jesus is, you have heard it said, but I say.
Yes.
Asserting just a completely different level of confidence and authority and part of that is probably what offends the Pharisees especially. They're expecting, let's say, the Lord, and here comes Jesus. This is what I say, and you need to listen to me.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a big difference.
Thus saith me.
Yes.
Yeah. Which you're right, is quite a bit different than in the Old Testament. There's the repeated refrain, whatever message I give you, you have to speak it. So, here's the scroll, eat it, or consume it in some way, or even with Isaiah, I've touched your lips, so I've put the words in your mouth. And yet with Christ, we have the sword coming out of his mouth. That, his words are the sword. His words are the word of God. So he's not even prophetic in the strictest sense of the term.
He's not a spokesman for God.
He's not a spokesman. He's not. So yes, he rises up like Deuteronomy 18. He rises up from among them as one of them, and yet, I wouldn't really say that he's a prophet per se.
Yeah, of the prophet, priest, and king, I've always felt like Jesus was. It's less clear that he's prophet than he is priest or king. There's more weight in those roles, which is interesting because David has more weight in the king and priest role than prophet.
Actually, maybe it's more Christ's life serves that prophetic role, which is why I think Matthew comes first of the Gospels, because Matthew feels very much like a covenant lawsuit against Israel. And then you get to the rest of them and they kind of flesh out the theology. But Matthew's he just pours it on Israel. I sang a dirge and you didn't believe. I wept and mourned. You should have got it. And his life should have served as you should have seen this. You've been reading this for hundreds of years.
Yep.
You proclaim to be wise. Kind of like we talked about earlier, condemning those who thought they were wise.
Right.
Because Christ's life should have been enough.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we tie his prophetic ministry to the teaching aspect, that he's revelatory, but in some ways he's not really prophesying. We talked about what is prophecy. Prophecy is big picture, and yet he doesn't really give a whole lot of big picture other than that I am the big picture. So in some ways it's almost artificial to call him a prophet. In other ways, we get what we're getting at, just the idea of revelation. I know of some people that have responded or reacted against the idea of even an office of prophet and prefer to use the term seer or wise man, or they're more in that category than just a prophet, in order to avoid kind of the language of revelation. Because within the Gospels, John is referred to as a prophet. Jesus does in Matthew 13. He says, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. But there aren't a whole lot of other places where he refers to himself as a prophet.
Yeah, it feels like he almost takes on more of a minor prophet role
Mm-hmm.
in that he's not really concerned about the far off. He comes as, condemning the practices that are going on. Kind of like, reminds me a lot of Malachi.
Mm-hmm.
He comes
Yeah.
and he reveals to them what they're doing wrong, not necessarily
Yep.
future things, but what they're doing wrong and what they should be doing.
Yep.
Which is interesting.
Luke chapter 1, verse 76, just talking to John, you, child, shall be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways. So John's a prophet because he's the go-before.
Yeah, and there seems like, even for as little as he's in the Gospels, almost every time it's talking about him as a prophet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman was touching him, for she's a sinner. I must go on my way, and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem.
There's that sarcasm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Luke 24, on the road to Emmaus, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people.
An interesting definition for prophet, mighty indeed.
Mm-hmm. Search and see, no prophet arises from Galilee. Acts 7 is the speech by Stephen. But even he does not. Yeah, there really aren't any New Testament passages other than those common, few allusions. So mighty in word and deed makes a prophet, but again, it's not. Yeah.
Jesus enacts prophetic things too, though. So when he heals the widow's son, or when he feeds the multitude, that's Elisha.
Mm-hmm.
He's being the greater Elisha, just like John was the greater Elijah. So there's
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. He says, "I'm going to give you the sign of the prophet Jonah." So
Mhm.
he's Jonah.
Yes.
In a weird way. Jonah's like the weirdest type of Christ.
Oh yeah, no.
He's not,
So weird.
but he is.
Yeah.
He's
He's a
unwillingly.
terrible person.
He's unwillingly a type of Christ. So
Uh-huh.
you've got, the sort of the actions going along with it.
Yeah.
And I think in Holy Week is when he's most prophetic,
Mm-hmm.
because he's doing all the symbolic actions. He's riding in on a donkey, he clears the temple, and then proclaims, this is supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations. He curses the fig tree, which also explains what he's doing in the temple, looking for fruit. It's not there.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things that he doesn't really act like that during the rest of his ministry.
Right.
But it's almost like when he rides into Jerusalem, he becomes the prosecutor.
Yeah.
That's when he gives the end times. Matthew
That's when he
25.
gives Matthew
Was that
24.
last week? Obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
he indicts the religious leaders. So
Yeah.
I was actually preaching on that a couple months ago.
Hmm.
And, only one commentary pointed this out, so I don't really know what I think about it, but it pointed out that, the widow's mite is always you want to be like her. But it comes immediately after he has spent a whole speech indicting the religious leaders for taking the money from the poor
Hmm.
and eating up widows' houses and leaving them empty.
Hmm.
And then it's immediately after that he looks over and he says, you know what these other people are giving out of their abundance, but she just gave everything she had. almost as if to say, shouldn't someone have stopped her and said, look, lady,
Mm.
you don't have this to give. God doesn't expect this from you.
Wow.
Mm.
But instead they're just like, give, give, give. You know?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So, Jesus, it's all, he's indicting everybody, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when they're like, okay, we're going
Right.
Okay, cool.
This is enough. So,
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Huh. Yeah. Well, you can't read two texts like that together, though. You got to read them as separate.
yeah.
There's no seam there. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so Jesus, in some ways, as much as we call him a prophet because he reveals God's law to us, is revelatory. He's mighty in word and deed. One of the things that can be trouble is if we tie Jesus's role of prophet to the canon. When the canon is closed, does Jesus stop being a prophet because he's no longer revealing it?
Well, that's a question.
And I would make the argument that the Holy Spirit continues that prophetic work of Christ by illuminating and teaching and still reminding us of the big picture.
Come alive.
Yeah. And so, he's prophetic still in that, even yesterday as we were talking about putting Joel, Zechariah, Daniel, putting each of those perspectives in line, the immediate, the coming, and the far future of, it's the Holy Spirit that really emphasizes that, really teaches us that, and has us keep those in mind.
This might be too much of a question for now, but the church today also has a prophetic role, doesn't it? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to speak to culture in a prophetic way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's interesting too, is the church as Christ, and so maybe that's also how Christ's prophetic role continues, because we are his body,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a prophetic duty.
Yep.
And we were talking about it last night. The church is pretty irrelevant right now, it seems
Right.
like, and maybe partially because we're preaching truth once again, partially because we're not obeying the command to be a prophetic voice to the world.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder.
Yeah. Yeah. Go
You
ahead.
said that was more of a priestly role, didn't you?
Yeah, and I think to some degree, yes, in terms of if we're reminding people of the law and condemning them, because there's no covenant really between, unless you want to go with covenant creation. So we're not really covenant prosecutors. But on the other hand, there is a prophetic role in terms of announcing and reminding people of the big picture. That is more a prophetic role of the church, that we're reminding people as we're, part of my initial thought about priests and prophets in terms of which is a priestly role, which is a prophetic role, is that nothing's being revealed, so we're not prophets. And yet the prophets really interact a lot with history.
Right.
And are always applying scripture to what's going on in their day.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I even as we talked last night of, when the church speaks prophetically, it speaks prophetically after like a 9/11, after COVID or during COVID, in COVID, of this is how we interact with COVID.
Yeah.
And I think some of that is where it kind of got lost, is that we tended to take more of a priestly role in COVID in terms of trying to explain to people what you should and shouldn't do during COVID. Let's take the law and let's apply it to our churches. Let's apply it to culture. You should not cancel services. You should cancel services. You should not wear masks. You should wear masks, which was fine. I mean, those questions, I suppose, need to be asked and answered. But that's more of a priestly role, whereas the prophetic role should have been sitting up and telling our world, similar to the locusts, look, you think this is bad, just wait.
Yeah.
But that message was lost because of the internal, I would just say, bickering in the church over how we were going to respond in terms of the law. Whether or not churches meet during COVID is more of an internal issue. But that was really what became the biggest debate
among churches was, should we meet or not? And I have opinions about that too, but that's not really something that we need to tell our culture. They don't care. When they make a law against it, like they did out in California, okay, yeah, we got to respond to that. But beyond that, we spent more of our energy trying to deal with law issues than we did with, here's an opportunity to be prophetic. So when I think of being prophetic, I think of it, when we speak, we need to speak prophetically to our culture. It's not so much us condemning the things in the culture that are wrong. That's us being priestly and applying God's law. Prophetic is more big picture, reminding them God is in control, reminding them of the sovereignty of God, reminding them that, he sits enthroned in heaven, laughs. Those things are more prophetic issues in terms of the grandiose plan of God rather than the law. And yet there is a priestly role where, we are applying the law, we are offering, Christ, our evangelism in some ways comes out more priestly in terms of law gospel, but our evangelism comes out more prophetic in terms of historical redemptive. Here's where we are in history. Here's where we're going. And, reminding the President of the United States of, it doesn't take much to bring the world to its knees. So you should get on your knees. Yeah. That's a prophetic role. Whereas a priestly role is more, you can't make that law. That law is contrary to God's law. Can't make that law. So, us standing up against, abortion, I would say is more of almost a priestly element. I don't know that I would have said that at the beginning of the class. Even at the beginning of the class when we met, I said, that's a priestly role, not prophetic. But I think I would say now, though, there is a prophetic role, and it's not law-based as much as it is big picture-based.
Yeah. Would it be right to say, I don't know, when you think about what the prophets were doing, they were speaking to the culture and the people that they were in the midst of, and kind of saying, this is happening, but this is how God feels about it. This is what God thinks about it. This is, he hates your worship. I don't know, is it taking the things in our culture and saying, hey, this is not just what God's law says, but this is what God's heart is for you and for these things and for the world in a broader sense, big picture sense, I guess.
Yeah, priestly function is almost more of judging, condemning, forgiving, whereas prophetic role is more, let me tell you what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Toby Sumter, he wrote a book on it called Blood Bought, because he was actually arguing for a little bit of a different approach of, we need to somewhat attack it covenantally because they're covenant breakers.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know where that would fall between priest and prophet, because you could argue, it's a covenantal problem, so why wouldn't you go for a covenantal solution? And I don't know if that's an oversimplification, it probably is, but that's an interesting thought too, is in some sense they're covenant breakers, but is that really going to be effective if I point that out to them?
Yeah.
Because most of them don't. Most of them don't believe that on the basis of creation we're in covenant with God.
Right.
So, I don't know.
And even some of it of, Adam already broke that covenant.
Yeah.
So you're breaking a covenant that's already been broken.
Yeah.
So, there is a priestly and prophetic role. And I think even the prophets as covenant prosecutors, I get the impression that was because the priests weren't doing it, that even that should have been a priestly role.
So almost kind of it feels like they had to take the kingly wisdom role as well. They're kind of fulfilling more roles than they were meant for.
Yeah.
In a sense.
I think anytime that we call our church, when we speak to, this is not what the church should be, we're falling into more of a prophetic role because we're challenging the offices for abuses within the church of, we're challenging elders, we're challenging pastors, we're challenging missionaries of, this is not right. If you were doing your job, I wouldn't have to be here. That's more prophetic. And then when, even within the church, when we're calling people to holiness, that's more of a priestly role. And to some degree, I think there's even an element of which we have a kingly role as well, as we're subduing creation and that cultural mandate. So we are really prophet, priest, and king, as Christ is prophet, priest, and king. So as a church, we do fulfill some of those roles. and yet there is a lot of overlap of should the church be king? In some ways, no, we're prophets and priests of the king, even though our individual members will have some kingly roles.
Right.
But us decrying a lack of justice is more of a prophetic thing. And yet, if we were kings, we would just do it. But usually, the judge is calling the king to account for not doing it.
Yeah.
So, we should be encouraging people in our churches to take on those leadership positions. But the church should also be one of the leaders in terms of decrying injustice, not social justice, but social justice at the same time.
This class has showed me, there's a wider range of what it means to be a prophet, priest, and king.
Yeah.
And when you first think, because we oftentimes try to box in the
Yes.
prophets or box in the priests.
Yeah.
And it feels like it goes pretty far into, you should just name it one thing almost at some points.
There's a lot of overlap there.
You kind of do the same, you're fulfilling the roles on all different times in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and it even blurs the line even with Jesus when you ask that question: is he a prophet, or is he a priest, or is he both, or is he neither? You really got to stop and think through and define your terms. And well, yes, but no, but maybe, but yeah, I guess. And, yeah.
Yeah. Well, if Jesus is the new Adam, and he's the ultimate human, what we should be, what we're made to be, then yeah, like those three roles are just different aspects of his character, different ways of viewing and seeing his work in the world. So there should be overlap.
Yep.
They should be connected.
Well, as I stood in the shower this morning, I thought, are we going to be able to come up with enough to fill 4 hours?